Across the endless white reaches of the Arctic, ships, aircraft, and intrepid explorers have ventured into a world both beautiful and unforgiving, drawn by curiosity, ambition, and the promise of discovery. Here, amid drifting ice, hidden currents, and skies that flare with northern light, expeditions have vanished without warning, leaving behind only fragments of journals, warped equipment, and whispered tales of misfortune. As we trace the paths of these lost explorers, from ships crushed by relentless ice to flights swallowed by the blinding whiteness of polar skies, and from small scientific teams trapped by sudden storms to ambitious quests that ended in mutiny and starvation, each story uncovers not only the harsh realities of survival in a frozen world, but also the inexplicable events that defy explanation, inviting us to confront a land where the boundaries of human knowledge are tested and sometimes claimed by the Arctic itself. The Vanishing of the Karluk, 1913. The early winter of 1913 settled heavily over the western Arctic, drawing long shadows across the drifting pack ice where the Karluk, flagship of the Canadian Arctic expedition, pushed northward into conditions no chart or prediction could fully capture. The mission, ambitious in design and uncertain in its preparations, had begun as a scientific venture meant to expand knowledge of the high latitudes, yet almost from the start the ship found itself locked in a landscape that shifted and fractured without warning. The men aboard spoke of distant pressure ridges that groaned through the night, of dark openings in the ice that appeared where solid ground had stood hours earlier, and of a silence that felt closer to a presence than an absence. Their commander, Captain Robert Bartlett, had navigated difficult waters before, but as the days shortened and the temperature fell, even he realized that the Karluk's fate was becoming entwined, not with their mission's objectives, but with the unpredictable life of the Arctic itself. As January approached, the ship lay completely frozen in, its wooden hull creaking as if protesting each new squeeze of the ice. The Karluk drifted westward towards Siberia, carried by slow, relentless currents the crew could neither anticipate nor influence. This involuntary movement unnerved the men, especially as the distance between the expedition's planned route and their actual trajectory widened. Scientific instruments recorded their drift with almost clinical precision, yet nothing in those readings captured the unease felt by those who watched the ice surface cracking into black voids. Snow huts began to rise on the floe near the trapped ship, built as a precaution against the hull collapsing, but the crude structures cast odd shadows in the dim polar light that made some speak quietly of shapes moving in the distance, though no living creatures could be seen on the horizon. During the first weeks of the new year, the strain increased. The ice that once seemed stable began to shift beneath their feet, breaking open with sudden booms that sent vibrations through the ship's timbers. Captain Bartlett encouraged the crew to keep busy with the daily routines, yet even he could not ignore the unmistakable sounds of structural failure echoing through the hull. On January 10th, the ice tightened its grip, and the ship began to list at a dangerous angle. Several men recorded in their journals long, trembling lines describing how the deck tilted and the masts groaned overhead, as though the Karluk itself sensed what was coming. When the inevitable collapse arrived, the hull cracked open and seawater poured in, transforming their vessel into a sinking memory. The men scrambled for supplies they had prearranged on the ice, their breath freezing as it left their mouths, while behind them the Karluk slipped slowly beneath the surface until only a disorder of splintered wood remained. With the ship gone, the expedition became a survival ordeal on a drifting ice floe that had no loyalty to the people stranded upon it. Bartlett took command of the group that remained, guiding them toward a plan that involved reaching Wrangel Island, which lay to the west across a region of unstable ice. Yet this strategy depended on weather, visibility, and the unpredictable fractures that crisscrossed the terrain. Travel across the floe was slow, the sledges frequently halted by ridges that forced detours stretching the journey into days longer than intended. The men carried scientific equipment, rifles, and what remained of their provisions, though each evening brought the same question of how long the food would last. The growing sense of isolation deepened when polar bears began to appear at the edges of their camps, their pale forms blending with the snow until they seemed to rise out of the landscape without warning. By mid-January, Bartlett recognized that their survival required a decisive and hazardous action. Accompanied by the Inuit hunter Kataktovik, he set out on a long trek toward Siberia to seek rescue, leaving the remaining crew members under the leadership of those he trusted most. The decision weighed heavily on him, yet there was little choice. Their camp was positioned on an ice mass that felt increasingly unstable, shifting under pressure from unseen forces. Journals later recovered from survivors recorded nights interrupted by distant cracks that travelled through the ice like slow-moving thunder. Snow drifted in fine sheets over the tents, giving the illusion that the world outside had smoothed into silence, though beneath that calm the flow continued to weaken. After Bartlett's departure, the group on the floe faced a slow erosion of morale as well as the stark reality of diminishing resources. Several attempted to reach Wrangel Island on their own, driven by a mix of determination and desperation. Their route took them across dangerous leads, some barely frozen and others deceptively thin. Evidence found later suggested they encountered open water, where ice should have been solid, forcing them to leap between fragments that shifted beneath their weight. The Arctic environment provided no margin for hesitation, and the smallest misstep could strand a man on a piece of ice that drifted into obscurity. Some of their final notes describe figures seen in the distance that vanished when approached, shapes that could have been men or mirages formed by cold air shimmering over the frozen surface. Those who reached Wrangel Island discovered that the island offered little comfort. Wind scoured the shoreline with abrasive force, and the interior held scarce resources. Hunting became increasingly difficult as fatigue set in, and the survivors lived in makeshift shelters that let in both cold air and drifting snow. The remnants of their scientific goals faded completely as survival consumed every thought. The island's isolation was absolute. No ship passed its waters during those months, and no signs of human life could be found beyond their own small circle of tents. When Bartlett eventually reached Siberia and managed to summon help, the rescue that followed came far too late for many. When the relief party arrived on Wrangel Island, they found only a handful of exhausted men, gaunt from hunger and cut off from the world for months. The others had died under conditions that remained partially unclear, with some deaths attributed to starvation and others to exposure. Yet fragments of reports hinted at an atmosphere of confusion and disorientation during their final days. The survivors rarely spoke in detail about what had happened, and the few belongings gathered from abandoned camps offered little clarity. Even today, the Karluk disaster remains one of the most unsettling Arctic tragedies, not only for the loss of life, but for the unanswered questions about those final isolated weeks on the drifting ice. Something in that frozen wilderness seemed to swallow the truth before anyone could reach it. The lost Greenland expedition of Mylius Eriksson, 1907. In the far reaches of northeast Greenland, the early winter light seemed to flatten the landscape into a vast, pale silence that revealed nothing of what lay beyond the next rise of snow. The Denmark expedition, led by Ludvig Mylius Eriksson in 1907, moved through this quiet immensity with a purpose rooted in geography and national aspiration, seeking to complete the mapping of Peary Land and resolve lingering uncertainties about the region's coastline. Their plan depended on the belief that the interior routes would remain navigable long enough for their return, but those first days already hinted at the enormity of the distances they would have to cross. Snowfields stretched out in uninterrupted swathes, the horizon blending sky and earth into a single muted band that erased all sense of scale. In such a setting, even experienced explorers found themselves relying on the rhythms of the dogs, the weight of the sledges, and the faint lines of memory more than any identifiable landmark. Far inland, where the ice caps stretched into an unbroken sheet of white, the Mylius Eriksson party advanced into territory so featureless that direction became a matter of instinct as much as navigation. Their sledges carried instruments essential to completing the northern map, compasses adapted for high latitudes, notebooks sealed in oiled cloth, and detailed records of their measurements, but the practical realities of the terrain steadily interfered. Winds drifting from the north brought a fine powder of snow that obscured their tracks within minutes, forcing them to halt repeatedly to adjust course. Each temporary camp gave them glimpses of conditions that shifted faster than they could interpret, with the temperature dropping into ranges that stiffened their clothing and froze breath into brittle shapes that scattered across the ground. Though the men remained confident in their skills, The geography of northeast Greenland had a way of absorbing all signs of progress, turning their movements into small, nearly invisible marks on a surface that refused to show its contours. The final confirmed sighting of Mylius Eriksson, Huig Hagen and Jürgen Bronlund came on a day when the wind had settled into an uneasy stillness that gave no hint of the hardship ahead. They were last seen heading toward the head of Danmark Fjord, convinced that the northern coastline connected in a way that no previous expedition had been able to verify. Their supplies were adequate, though not abundant, and their dogs showed the fatigue of weeks spent ascending over hard ridges and drifting plains. Observers recalled the steadiness of Mylius Eriksson's stride and the concentration with which Hagen studied his maps, their focus suggesting they were secure in their calculations. Yet those who watched them depart could not have known that the fjord extended far deeper and more unpredictably than the chart suggested, lengthening their journey by distances that would test even the strongest team. The fading figures of the three men thus became the final moment of certainty before their path dissolved into the empty Greenlandic interior. When the expected return of the mapping party failed to materialize, the searchers who set out after them found the landscape transformed into a maze of scoured drifts and half-buried sled tracks. Days of strong winds had carved the snow into jagged patterns that confused even seasoned travelers, masking the earlier routes taken by the lost party. The search teams followed faint depressions where sledges might have passed, only to lose them again in regions where the snow lay undisturbed and smooth. Deposits of frozen dog food and small markers, stones piled atop fragments of ice, offered occasional proof that the missing group had passed through, yet each clue felt incomplete. A half-story left in the snow, with no explanation for why the trail suddenly veered or disappeared. The further they went, the more the expedition's traces dissolved, as if the land itself resisted any attempt to follow the exact sequence of steps taken by the three men. There were moments when the searchers paused and listened, expecting some distant call, but all they heard was the low hum of wind moving across the open plateau. The discovery of Bronlund's frozen form near the edge of Lambert Land offered the first concrete evidence of what had happened, though the quiet around him seemed to swallow more explanations than it provided. His body lay partly sheltered in a shallow depression, and beside him were Hagen's notebooks, carefully wrapped despite the brutal conditions of their final days. His diary contained a brief, restrained account written in a firm hand that had not yet lost its clarity. The two others had fallen, he wrote, and he himself had been unable to continue. The entry gave no details of the final struggle, no description of the snowstorms or distances that had forced them beyond their limits, only a stark acknowledgement of his own exhaustion. The condition of the site suggested they had pushed themselves across the ice until survival became mathematically impossible, driven by a determination to meet the coastline and return with their observations. Yet the silence surrounding Bronlund's final hours created a sense that much of what had happened had been swallowed by the monotone sweep of wind and frost. Long after the expedition ended, the unanswered questions surrounding the disappearance of Mylius Eriksson and Huig Hagen lingered in the empty spaces of East Greenland's cliffs and fjords. Records recovered from Hagen's maps showed that the men had made significant progress in charting previously unknown stretches of coastline, even as their path bent into regions where storms commonly rose without warning. Searchers who later revisited the area noted that shifts in weather could erase tracks in minutes and reshape the surface of frozen fjords so completely that whole routes vanished overnight. Their bodies were never found, leaving only the impressions of their observations and the fragments of their final movements contained in Bronlund's preserved words. The geography itself, sharp ridges overlooking deep inlets, plateaus swept clean by powerful winds, seemed implicated in their disappearance, forming a landscape capable of concealing any trace of the men who crossed it. Even with modern mapping, the area holds pockets of isolation where the world feels as unreachable as it did more than a century ago, and still today, the last steps of the lost party seem to fade into a silence that has never fully surrendered its truth. The Doomed Voyage of the Jeannette, 1879. Belief in a navigable polar sea shaped the early ambitions of the Jeannette expedition, giving its departure an air of certainty that masked the vast uncertainties ahead. The United States Navy, driven by the theories of cartographer August Peterman, hoped that by pushing through the Bering Strait, the vessel could break past the coastal pack and reach open water near the pole, unveiling a northern ocean yet unseen. George Washington DeLong, recently returned from Arctic service, accepted command of the borrowed vessel once the British gunboat Pandora, after it was strengthened for ice and renamed Jeannette. As the ship steamed north in 1879, the sense of purpose among the officers and crew mixed with a quiet awareness that the Arctic allowed no miscalculation to pass without consequence. Yet optimism held fast during those early days, carrying the expedition into the narrowing lanes of the Chukchi Sea, where the first signs of drifting ice hinted at an invisible boundary between familiar waters and the deep uncertainties beyond. A low, grinding tremor along the hull signalled the moment the pack ice began tightening its grip, turning open water into a solid, shifting barrier. The men gathered on deck felt the ship shiver as the floes closed in, the timbers groaning under a pressure that no reinforcement could fully resist. By September 1879, the Jeannette was immobilized far from any hope of retreat, locked within a frozen continent that stretched in every direction. DeLong ordered the sails furled and the engines shut down, accepting that the expedition had transitioned from navigation to survival, forced into the long drift dictated by winds and currents that pushed the vessel northwest into deeper polar waters. Weeks blended into months while the ship drifted past Wrangel Island, once believed to be part of a northern landmass, and further toward regions only dimly understood through earlier accounts. The ice hardened around the vessel until it became part of the landscape itself, a static shape in a world sculpted by cold and silence. A lantern swinging gently from a cabin beam became a quiet metronome of confinement, marking each hour the crew remained locked within the frozen ship. Daily routines became rituals of endurance, tending coal reserves, rationing stores, charting the vessel's drift, recording temperatures that plunged far below zero. Naturalist George W. Melville catalogued the environment with the persistence of a man trying to anchor meaning in the monotony, while surgeon James Ambler monitored the men for scurvy and morale. The Arctic night deepened into a near-endless darkness that erased distinctions between morning and evening, broken only by faint movements in the ice or distant, muffled reports from cracking pressure ridges. Although the crew maintained discipline, a subtle tension spread whenever frost crept inside the walls, or when supply inventories revealed the hidden cost of each passing day. In the stillness of that first winter, the Jeannette drifted farther north than any American vessel had gone, yet the achievement held none of the triumph once imagined for it, only the fragile hope that the ship would endure beneath the crushing weight of its surroundings. A sharp crack beneath the wooden planking broke the morning stillness, the kind of sound that hinted at forces gathering beyond human control. The pressure had been building for months, but by June 1881 the ice shifted violently, driving ridges against the hull with immense force. DeLong ordered emergency stations as the vessel heeled under the sustained assault, the deck buckling as if the entire structure were being twisted. The timbers finally gave way on June 12th, when a thunderous roar reverberated through the ice field and the Jeannette began to break apart. Water rushed into the lower compartments, rising too quickly to stem or contain, leaving DeLong with only one command that mattered: abandon ship. In the chaos, the men salvaged provisions, chronometers, rifles, and 3 small boats, dragging them across the ice while the ship that had carried them into the Arctic sank slowly into the dark water beneath the floes. The disappearance of the Jeannette left the crew stranded in one of the least forgiving regions on Earth, separated from the nearest inhabited settlement by hundreds of miles of broken sea ice and uncertain weather. Each step across the fractured ice sent faint vibrations through the boots of the men, reminders that the ground beneath them was never truly still. The survivors began their journey south in hopes of reaching the Lena Delta in Siberia, navigating shifting leads of open water and fields of rubble ice that forced detours stretching far off any planned route. The 3 boats, whaleboat, cutter and dinghy, were dragged across pressure ridges, lowered into melt ponds, and occasionally hauled back onto slabs of ice when the men needed rest. Fatigue deepened as supplies dwindled, and the ever-present danger of misjudging a crossing could send a man plunging through ice too thin to support his weight. Yet DeLong pressed the party forward, believing that reaching the Siberian coast remained a realistic goal if they could maintain their pace. When open water finally appeared, The crew launched the boats despite worsening weather, trusting that navigation by dead reckoning and memory would be enough to carry them toward the delta's distant channels. By the time the light settled into its pale autumn dimness over the Lena Delta, the journey had taken on a harsher, more desperate shape. Storms scattered the three boats during the final push toward land, leaving DeLong's group stranded along the delta's eastern channels while Melville's party landed far to the south. The terrain offered little relief: shallow, freezing water, dense reeds and shifting mudflats that hid channels and confounded navigation. Starvation overtook DeLong's group first, forcing the men to write final notes and lie down in the cold when strength failed. Melville, having settled, later searched the delta and discovered the remains of DeLong, Ambler, and several others near the banks of a remote tributary. Their journals, preserved in the cold, recounted a struggle marked by endurance, loyalty, and decisions made under ever-tightening constraints. Only a portion of the crew survived the ordeal, and the tragedy left behind a trail of observations and testimonies that mapped the slow unravelling of a venture once guided by unwavering conviction. A fate sealed by shifting ice can leave questions moving long after the last footprints fade. The Deadly Mystery of the Franklin Expedition, 1845. The streets of London buzzed with anticipation as HMS Erebus and Terror readied for the journey that promised to complete the Northwest Passage, carrying 129 men whose fate would vanish into the Arctic unknown. Sir John Franklin, a seasoned naval officer, commanded the expedition with meticulous planning, ensuring the ships were reinforced for ice, provisioned with the latest tinned foods, and outfitted with steam engines to supplement their sails. Officers and crew alike held a sense of solemn purpose, believing that careful preparation could overcome the harshest environment on Earth. Yet beneath the optimism lurked the inevitability of unpredictability. Arctic charts were incomplete, currents and ice movements largely unmapped, and the very landscape they sought to navigate had swallowed countless explorers before them. Even as the ship sailed through Baffin Bay in May 1845, the region's vast emptiness hinted that this voyage would test endurance, resolve, and ultimately survival in ways no man could yet foresee. As the ships crept northward, the waters narrowed and darkened under drifting floes, a subtle reminder that even the best provisioned expedition could be swallowed by a world few had ever seen. Summer passed quickly in the high latitudes, and by July 1845, European eyes lost track of the Erebus and Terror. The men faced the first tangible signs of isolation, a frozen maze of ice floes extending beyond the horizon, drifting without discernible pattern and trapping the vessels in regions far from assistance. Inuit accounts later recounted sightings of stranded crews struggling across the ice, lending a fragmentary perspective on what had become a slow, inexorable drift into uncertainty. Each day the Arctic revealed subtle hazards, hidden pressure ridges, slushy leads, and deceptive open water that could collapse under the weight of men or boats. The environment transformed from a stage for exploration into an oppressive presence, one that absorbed every trace of human intention and left only fragmentary evidence of passage. A scattered depot of tinned provisions and a hastily scrawled note on King William Island were the first fragments of evidence hinting at the route the men had taken and the danger that awaited them. When search parties finally reached the island in 1848, they found skeletal remains and the remnants of abandoned supplies carefully placed as if to preserve some semblance of order. The notes, written in fading ink, told of retreat from the ice, dwindling rations, and the onset of cold and illness, yet they left crucial questions unanswered. Why were some provisions untouched, and what decisions had led men to move further south into an increasingly hostile landscape? Even these small traces conveyed the discipline and determination of the crew, while simultaneously hinting at the chaos that had grown as the ice tightened its hold. The evidence offered a partial narrative, but the story of their final movements remained incomplete, leaving gaps that would not be reconciled for decades. Bones uncovered decades later bore marks that spoke of hunger and extreme measures, whispering the grim story of survival forced beyond human limits. Forensic analysis revealed cut marks consistent with cannibalism, confirming the extremity of conditions faced by the men. Signs of scurvy, lead poisoning from tinned food and ship equipment, and exposure were apparent in skeletal remains, demonstrating a convergence of environmental and human factors that overwhelmed the crew. Bodies were scattered across desolate ice fields, some found near caches of supplies, others at surprising distances from the ship's last known positions. The forensic evidence provided glimpses of decision-making under extreme stress, the paths chosen, the divisions between parties, the last attempts to march southward. Yet for all that could be learned, the precise circumstances of each death remained uncertain, leaving a lingering tension between knowledge and mystery. Beneath layers of sediment and drifting ice, the hulks of Erebus and Terror lay silent for more than a century, preserving the echoes of a voyage whose human end remained unknown. Discovered in 2014 and 2016, respectively, the ships were remarkably intact, upright on the seabed and revealing artifacts from the final days of their cruise. Observers noted the paradox of their preservation. While the vessels endured the Arctic's destructive forces, the men who had commanded them vanished, leaving behind only notes, skeletal remains and traces of their efforts. The ship's positions and the materials recovered offered clues to the decisions made during the retreat, the courses charted and the survival preparations, but they could not convey the full measure of human suffering endured in the relentless cold. In this way, the vessels became both evidence and enigma, silent witnesses to a tragedy whose human details the ice had absorbed. Even as modern explorers and archaeologists traced the footprints left in snow and river channels, the final hours of Franklin's men remained a puzzle without resolution, a story written more in absence than in presence. Inuit oral histories provided fragmented accounts of survivors moving across the tundra, some succumbing to starvation, others to exposure. Journals recovered with the skeletal remains hinted at a meticulous record-keeping and adherence to duty even in extreme duress. Yet the exact sequence of events, the decisions made in blizzards, the dispersal of parties, the moments when survival tipped into desperation, can never be fully reconstructed. The Arctic landscape, with its frozen rivers, shifting ice and hidden inlets, had absorbed these final steps, leaving a traceable yet incomplete map of human endeavour and its abrupt termination. In the frozen stillness of the Arctic, their vanished path lingers like a question the ice refuses to answer. Nobila's airship Italia crash, 1928. The airship Italia lifted from Ny-Ålesund under a pale May sky, carrying Umberto Nobile and his crew into the unknown reaches of the Arctic, where every mile promised both triumph and peril. Designed as a semi-rigid dirigible 96 metres long, the Italia represented the pinnacle of contemporary aeronautical engineering, complete with multiple engines and a reinforced framework intended to withstand the rigours of polar flight. Nobile, a veteran of previous Arctic explorations, commanded a team of experienced officers, engineers and navigators, all chosen for their skill and endurance. Their mission was audacious: fly to the North Pole, conduct observations and return safely to Svalbard. Optimism and national pride imbued the departure, as the crew believed technology and careful planning could conquer one of the planet's harshest environments. Yet even in this early phase, subtle tensions and the unpredictability of weather hinted at the fragile margin between success and catastrophe. From their lofty vantage, the men saw a frozen tapestry of shifting ice and clouds stretching beyond the horizon, a landscape both mesmerizing and disorienting in its vastness. The Arctic appeared as a silent expanse of white and grey, broken only by distant leads and pressure ridges, which offered no fixed reference points. Instruments struggled to maintain accurate readings amid the intense cold, and even small variations in wind speed created unexpected drift. Below them, the pack ice appeared deceptively static, yet currents shifted flows continuously, reminding the crew that the solid-looking surface could conceal treacherous instability. Nobile and his officers maintained vigilance, scanning the horizon and adjusting the engines to compensate, knowing that every decision would be tested against a sky and terrain neither fully mapped nor forgiving. A sudden shiver ran through the airframe as frost clung to the envelope, hinting at the hidden dangers that wind and ice could unleash without warning. On May 24, 1928, as the airship approached the North Pole, the crew encountered unexpected storm conditions, with wind gusts forcing sudden corrections in altitude and course. Ice accumulated on the gondola and rigging, weighing down the structure and compromising manoeuvrability. Even minor mechanical strains, invisible at first glance, began to escalate as tension in the envelope increased and engines struggled against headwinds. The men worked frantically to adjust ballast and stabilize the ship, but each measure only momentarily delayed the inevitable. In a remote region far beyond rescue, small miscalculations carried amplified consequences, and the crew confronted the reality that the Arctic sky could turn from wonder to threat in an instant. With a groan of metal and fabric, the Italia struck the uneven pack ice, breaking apart under the weight of its own ambition and the unforgiving Arctic sky. The crash scattered the crew across the ice. Some were killed instantly, while 16 survived, clinging to fragments of the airship. Equipment, instruments, and parts of the envelope were salvaged to provide shelter, but the drifting ice offered no stable platform and no guarantee of safety. The survivors faced disorientation and exposure as the Arctic winds drove snow and slush over the wreckage, threatening to erase even the smallest signs of habitation. Each movement had to be calculated. Even simple tasks became acts of endurance. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long, cold shadows, the magnitude of the isolation became undeniable. Help was distant, and the pack ice moved with silent indifference. Snow swirled around the wreckage, freezing every surface and turning even minor movements into monumental effort, while fragments of the torn envelope provided both fragile shelter and reminders of the airship's sudden fragility. As the survivors gathered within the remnants of the Italia, they discovered that some critical equipment had survived the crash, including parts of the engines, navigation instruments, and limited emergency rations. Nobile immediately organized teams to salvage usable materials, attempting to create a temporary camp on the drifting ice. They marked the site with debris to signal potential rescuers and kept careful watch on ice movements that threatened to separate or overturn their shelter. The frozen envelope fragments, though tattered, provided some insulation from the Arctic wind, while metal and canvas were repurposed to form rudimentary windbreaks. This period of frantic improvisation underscored both the ingenuity of the crew and the fragility of human enterprise in an environment that allowed no margin for error. Huddled within the tattered remains of the airship, the survivors counted each hour against the cold, each moment a reminder that rescue was uncertain and peril immediate. Temperatures plunged well below freezing, and exhaustion, frostbite, and hunger threatened to overcome the strongest men. Radio equipment salvaged from the wreck allowed intermittent contact with Norwegian and Soviet rescue teams, but atmospheric conditions and drifting ice complicated transmission. Polar bears prowled nearby floes, adding a predator's uncertainty to the already tenuous survival. The crew rationed supplies, huddled beneath canvas and debris, and kept watch for signs of approaching rescue, knowing that even a brief lapse could prove fatal. Days stretched into weeks, and the survivors relied on discipline, ingenuity, and sheer determination to remain alive amid the immense, indifferent Arctic. As search planes traced the drifting floes and distant radios carried fragmented signals, the Arctic landscape revealed both salvation and loss, leaving questions that no observer could fully answer. Eventually, after 48 harrowing days, Nobile and part of his crew were rescued, though several men perished during the wait or were lost during rescue attempts. Analysis of the incident pointed to a combination of extreme weather, technical limitations, and unpredictable ice conditions, yet the precise sequence of decisions, adjustments, and mechanical failures remained only partially understood. Contemporary records, survivor testimonies, and recovered equipment provide fragments of the ordeal, each raising new questions about human endurance and the challenges of polar aviation. Even decades later, scholars and explorers continue to study the Italia's flight, seeking to reconstruct how ambition met the immutable forces of nature in one of the Arctic's most isolated regions. The ice where the Italia fell holds its secrets tightly, whispering of flight failure and the fragile boundary between human courage and nature's indifference. The sinking of the Karluk sister ship, the Bear of Oakland, 1923. The Bear of Oakland slipped from port under a grey, heavy sky, her hull creaking with the weight of cargo and the promise of Arctic discovery. Originally built as a United States revenue cutter, she'd been reinforced and retrofitted for polar service, her thick wooden hull sheathed in steel to withstand the pressures of ice-packed waters. Supplies for remote settlements, meteorological instruments, and provisions for long voyages crowded the decks and hold, each item meticulously secured by experienced hands. Captain Francis A. Smith, commanding the vessel for the first time on this mission, oversaw a crew of officers, engineers and sailors who had spent years navigating the northern seas. Preparations included testing lifeboats, reviewing emergency procedures, and checking navigational tools, yet an undercurrent of unease lingered among the men. The Arctic was a landscape both familiar and unknowable, a place where confidence in human skill could quickly be exposed as fragile. Sheets of ice drifted silently across the horizon, and the compass wavered as magnetic anomalies whispered that the voyage would test both vessel and crew. Early on, fog reduced visibility to mere meters, while ice floes shifted unpredictably, threatening the hull with every collision. Observers noted that the Arctic ice never rested. Pressure ridges rose and fell, cracks opened without warning, and currents nudged massive floes into paths the crew had assumed were clear. Instruments, even those calibrated for polar navigation, occasionally faltered, leaving the officers to rely on experience, judgment, and careful observation of stars and sun angles. Each day brought both awe and tension, as the vast expanse of white seemed to stretch endlessly, emphasizing the smallness of the Bear of Oakland against the immensity of the frozen sea. Waves smashed over the deck with relentless rhythm, each swell reminding the men that the Arctic Sea offered no forgiveness for hesitation or error. Storms rolled in with little warning, forcing the crew to adjust sails and ballast under near-freezing spray. Water seeped into compartments, and the strain of ice against the reinforced hull produced groans that echoed through the timbers. Crew members laboured continuously, tightening lashings, securing cargo, and monitoring for leaks, yet exhaustion mounted quickly in the cold, wind-driven spray. Each day revealed that even minor oversights could escalate, and despite their rigorous training, the men recognized that survival depended on constant vigilance, precise coordination, and an almost intuitive understanding of the sea's capricious moods. A sudden roar of water bursting through weakened planks sent men scrambling as the Bear of Oakland began to list and founder amidst the storm. Waves crashed higher than the railings, and the ship tilted dangerously, forcing crew members to cling to anything solid to avoid being swept overboard. Lifeboats were hastily deployed, but icy seas immediately challenged their stability, capsizing one and tossing occupants into freezing water. The storm's roar made communication nearly impossible, and orders had to be shouted across decks slick with snow and ice. Within minutes, large sections of the vessel were submerged or torn away, leaving a chaotic scattering of debris and desperate men. In these moments, the meticulous planning and reinforced hull that had inspired confidence proved no match for the unrelenting Arctic Sea, and each survivor's focus narrowed to a singular goal: stay alive. Snow swirled around the wreckage, freezing every surface and turning even minor movements into monumental effort, while fragments of the torn hull provided both fragile shelter and reminders of the airship's sudden fragility. Survivors improvised shelters from lifeboats, tarps, and parts of the deck, arranging themselves to reduce exposure to the cutting wind. Water-soaked clothing stiffened almost instantly, forcing continuous movement to prevent hypothermia. Crew members huddled together for warmth, rationing the meagre supplies salvaged from the wreck. Some tried to signal distant ships by waving debris or using mirrors when sunlight broke through clouds, while others scouted for more stable ice flows. The Arctic offered no comfort, yet human ingenuity provided fragile lifelines in a landscape where even a single misstep could prove fatal. Clinging to lifeboats and scattered debris, the survivors faced a frozen expanse where each breath brought pain and every movement risked slipping into the icy depths. Days stretched interminably as they drifted on ice and open water, surrounded by endless grey and white, with only the occasional seabird or seal breaking the monotony. Hypothermia claimed energy and focus, forcing men to alternate rest and constant movement to survive. Navigation relied on observation of the sun, wind and currents, each decision informed by instinct and experience. Even the strongest realized that survival depended not just on courage, but on endurance, adaptability, and the shared will of those clinging to life alongside them. Every hour felt like a test against both the environment and the fragility of human determination. Days later, as search crews combed the shifting ice, the surviving men recounted fragments of the ordeal, yet gaps in memory and missing bodies left the full story forever uncertain. Rescuers pieced together debris fields and drift patterns to locate survivors, recovering some from lifeboats and others from makeshift ice camps. Investigators noted the ship's robust design and the crew's skill, yet also highlighted how quickly storms and floating ice could overwhelm even the most prepared vessel. Survivor testimonies described improvisation, near misses, and brief glimpses of hope amid despair, but the Arctic held its secrets tightly. The precise moments of loss, the fates of those washed away, and the intricate interplay of ice, wind, and sea currents remained partly unknowable. In the end, the episode became a testament to human perseverance and the immutable indifference of the northern oceans. The Arctic waters that swallowed the bear of Oakland guard their secrets still, as currents and ice carry whispers of vanished lives beyond any human reach. The fatal drift of the Ziegler Polar Expedition, 1903. From the edge of the northern ice, the Ziegler Polar Expedition set forth, sledges loaded with supplies and spirits tempered by both ambition and caution. Anthony F. Ziegler financed the venture, while Frederick Cook served as navigator and physician, tasked with guiding the men through uncharted expanses of northern Greenland. Their mission was to map unknown coastlines, study Arctic geography, and establish routes for future exploration. Supplies, carefully measured for months of travel, filled sledges alongside scientific instruments and provisions for sled dogs. The crew, composed of seasoned adventurers and skilled scientists, moved with deliberate efficiency, yet an undercurrent of uncertainty accompanied them. Even the strongest leaders understood that the Arctic could turn optimism into peril with little warning, and the first creak of ice underfoot was a reminder of the environment's silent authority. The first days revealed the ice's unpredictable nature, shifting beneath their sledges and whispering warnings of the hardships to come. Floes that appeared solid could fracture suddenly, and previously stable ridges buckled under the weight of men, dogs, and sledges. Magnetic anomalies confounded compass readings, and fog reduced visibility to mere meters at times, forcing travellers to rely on instinct and experience to maintain direction. Small cracks often concealed deeper weaknesses, threatening to swallow supplies or overturn sledges carrying vital instruments. Each day demanded constant vigilance, for even minor miscalculations could leave men stranded on unstable ice or separated from the main group, and the Arctic's vast silence amplified the weight of every misstep. Fog and snow blurred the horizon, transforming solid ice into a shifting maze that held the men captive with silent, relentless pressure. As the expedition drifted further north, monotony settled into their routines, yet subtle dangers lurked beneath every step. Sleep was fitful, taken in tents secured to ice with stakes that could shift or snap under pressure. The wind cut like blades, and the grey landscape offered no landmarks to distinguish one floe from another. Isolation deepened the psychological strain. Men grew tense, their conversations sparse and cautious. Even small disagreements risked fracturing morale, for the Arctic demanded cohesion and mutual reliance to survive. In this endless frozen expanse, the expedition's greatest challenge was not only the physical environment, but the erosion of hope in the human mind. Daily rations were measured with exacting care, while frostbitten fingers and dwindling fuel reminded the men of the unforgiving arithmetic of survival. Food and fuel caches were strategically distributed, yet drift and ice fractures forced improvisation. Sled dogs, vital for hauling supplies, began to weaken, and careful planning became a constant exercise in conservation. Water had to be melted over stoves that consumed scarce fuel, and each meal was both nourishment and a reprieve from the cold. Hypothermia and scurvy lurked as persistent threats, claiming energy and focus from even the hardiest men. Despite these hardships, the crew adapted, using sledges as makeshift shelters, rearranging tents and rationing supplies to maintain life and momentum across the ice. Each attempt to traverse the fractured ice brought new hazards, separating companions and leaving frozen traces that would never be fully understood. Several sledging parties tried to reach distant land or supply depots, only to be halted by open leads of water or ice too thin to cross. Storms could arise in minutes, turning small crests into dangerous swells that swept sledges from floe to floe. Some men became stranded on shifting sheets of ice, forced to improvise survival strategies while waiting for the floes to stabilize. Others succumbed to exhaustion, frostbite, or misjudged crossings, their final moments remaining obscured by the drifting white expanse. These tragedies compounded the sense of uncertainty for those who remained, who understood that rescue might arrive too late or not at all. Diaries filled with observations of temperature, wind, and ice drift became a lifeline, chronicling both scientific discovery and the slow erosion of hope. Cook and other officers meticulously recorded conditions, noting the subtle patterns of wind, ice movement, and animal behaviour that hinted at nearby land. Polar bears, seals, and seabirds appeared as fleeting reminders of life, but also underscored the men's isolation. Despite documenting the Arctic's natural rhythms, the crew could not fully anticipate the slow, invisible forces that would determine their survival. Each entry reflected both the explorers' curiosity and the grim awareness that their lives were subject to an environment indifferent to ambition or planning. Storms and sudden shifts in the ice left tents crushed and sledges stranded, reminding the men that every decision carried weight in the Arctic's indifferent calculus. Ice pressure could crush a camp overnight, forcing rapid relocation or the abandonment of vital supplies. Strong winds tore tarps and canvas, and blizzards coated equipment and clothing with layers of ice. The expedition's drift accelerated unpredictably, carrying men farther from caches and potential escape routes. In these conditions, survival depended not only on skill but on constant observation and improvisation, as the Arctic allowed no pause for reflection or error. Even routine movements could carry deadly consequences, and the landscape seemed to conspire against both calculation and courage. When relief finally arrived, it found survivors clinging to jagged floes and scattered equipment, while countless others had vanished into the white silence. Search parties traced the probable drift of sledges, recovered diaries and fragments of camps, and extracted the few men who had endured weeks of isolation and deprivation. Investigation of the expedition highlighted the relentless unpredictability of ice drift, the fragility of human endurance, and the bravery of those who had tried to navigate a world that offered no shelter from its own forces. Yet gaps remained, with many questions unanswered. The precise sequence of events, the fate of isolated sledging parties, and the decisions that had preserved life for some while claiming others. The Arctic, as always, held its secrets close. The Ziegler Polar Expedition left its mark on Arctic ice that continues to shift and crack, preserving its secrets in a vast wilderness untouched by time or memory. Amundsen's disappearance over the Barents Sea, 1928. Roald Amundsen took to the skies above Tromsø with a singular purpose, the frozen expanse of the Barents Sea stretching ahead as both highway and hazard. The famed Norwegian explorer, already celebrated for his North Pole and South Pole achievements, now led a desperate mission to locate the missing airship Italia, which had vanished during its own polar expedition. Accompanied by a skilled crew aboard a Latham 47 seaplane, Amundsen departed with urgency, fully aware of the dangers of flying over the Arctic in late spring. The aircraft, robust yet vulnerable in extreme conditions, carried navigation instruments, radio equipment, and emergency supplies for the uncertain journey ahead. Despite meticulous planning, the vastness of the Barents Sea and the unpredictable Arctic weather made the flight an immediate test of both human skill and mechanical endurance. Clouds merged with ice below in indistinct shades of grey, forcing the crew to navigate by instruments as the wind tested every seam of their seaplane. The Barents Sea offered little in the way of landmarks, and the horizon blurred constantly between frozen water and low-hanging clouds. Magnetic anomalies in high latitudes interfered with compasses, and sudden gusts of wind threatened to pitch the aircraft off course. Crew members strained to read altimeters and observe subtle changes in ice formations below, but even the most attentive eyes could misinterpret shifting patterns as solid terrain. Every decision, from adjusting throttle to compensating for drift, is a delicate negotiation with forces far beyond human control, and the Arctic sky seemed to mock the certainty of human endeavour with its vast, impartial indifference. A sudden silence fell over the radio waves, and the last known position of the aircraft dissolved into uncertainty, leaving those on the ground grasping at invisible threads. Amundsen's radio had transmitted routine coordinates earlier in the flight, but later communications ceased abruptly, confounding search parties and family alike. The abrupt loss of contact transformed a mission of rescue into one of immediate peril for those in the air. Radio operators in Tromsø monitored the static with growing alarm, while naval vessels and coastal stations scrambled to interpret the final signals. In those moments, the Arctic itself became an unseen arbiter, determining life or death without a witness, its vast white emptiness swallowing certainty and leaving only speculation. Icy gusts swept across the open water, snow and freezing spray turning the Barents Sea into a realm where even the most skilled pilot could be undone. Temperatures near freezing created thin layers of frost on the aircraft's wings and propeller, imperceptibly affecting lift and performance. The sea below, mottled with drifting ice floes and occasional open leads, presented an ever-changing hazard that required constant vigilance. Any misjudgment in altitude or speed could result in a fatal descent into the freezing water, where survival chances were measured in minutes. The relentless spray, the blinding whiteness, and the uncertainty of the horizon combined into a landscape both breathtaking and merciless, where human skill alone offered no guarantee against disaster. Ships and aircraft scoured the endless expanse, but drifting ice and storms concealed any trace of the vanished explorers, turning hope into fragile speculation. Search efforts involved a coordinated multinational response, with Norwegian, Soviet and Swedish vessels and aircraft attempting to cover vast stretches of sea. Observers combed for debris, signals or any sign of the missing plane, but the Arctic proved elusive. Ice floes drifted unpredictably, snowstorms obscured the surface, and strong winds scattered potential wreckage over kilometers. Even when faint signals or glimmers of debris were reported, they were often contradicted by the next storm or vanished into the shifting ice. The search underscored the immensity of the Barents Sea, a region indifferent to human effort and remarkably efficient at erasing its own traces. Some suggested the plane had met the sea's frozen embrace immediately, while others clung to reports of fleeting wreckage glimpsed by distant eyes, all leaving questions unanswered. Various theories circulated among explorers and historians. Engine failure in extreme cold, sudden gusts tipping the plane into the water, or a miscalculation in navigation that led to a collision with ice. Eyewitness accounts were few and often contradictory, adding layers of ambiguity to the unfolding mystery. Investigators pieced together flight plans, wind reports, and ocean currents, yet no definitive evidence emerged. In the absence of closure, the story of Amundsen's disappearance became intertwined with legend, as the Arctic itself seemed determined to preserve its secrets while challenging the limits of human understanding. Even as past triumphs cast long shadows, the disappearance underscored the Arctic's impartial authority, reminding the world that courage alone cannot command nature. Amundsen had previously navigated treacherous polar ice and ocean storms with extraordinary skill, yet the Barents Sea demanded a different kind of vigilance. The very qualities that had made him a successful explorer, boldness, decisiveness and resilience, were insufficient against the vast uncertainty of the air and sea. Reports from contemporary accounts reflect both admiration for his daring and the sobering reality that expertise cannot always counteract the environment. In the Arctic, every success carries the echo of risk, and even the most calculated ventures may vanish without a trace. Decades of study, analysis, and modern exploration have yet to resolve the flight's final moments, leaving the Barents Sea as both grave and archive of uncertainty. Ocean currents, ice drift patterns, and the sporadic scattering of debris have been examined by historians and marine archaeologists, yet the precise fate of Amundsen's plane remains unknown. Technological advances in mapping, sonar, and satellite observation have clarified many Arctic mysteries, but this event retains its haunting ambiguity. The lack of concrete evidence allows speculation to persist, compelling each generation to revisit the story with curiosity and caution. The Arctic, in its vastness and impartiality, continues to be both a historical record and a guardian of enigmas, holding tightly what humans strive to uncover. The Barents Sea holds the last whisper of Amundsen's flight, a frozen void where skill, courage and chance were swallowed by the Arctic's unyielding silence. The tragedy of the Karluk relief expedition, 1914. Vilhjalmur Stephenson and Captain Bartlett faced the Arctic with an urgent purpose, tasked with retrieving those left stranded on the shifting ice of the Karluk disaster. The original Karluk expedition, part of Stephenson's Canadian Arctic exploration, had ended in catastrophe when the ship became trapped in pack ice. leaving crew and explorers at the mercy of the frozen wilderness. Now, nearly a year later, the relief expedition pressed northward aboard the sturdy Bear, a vessel experienced in Arctic service. Equipped with provisions, sledges, and experienced seamen, the team understood the gravity of their mission. Each crew member knew that they were racing against both time and temperature, that the ice held both those to be saved and the cruel indifference of the polar environment. The crew navigated a labyrinth of floating ice, each turn revealing new hazards that could snap timbers, crush hulls, or strand men far from aid. The Arctic waters presented a shifting puzzle. Flows of variable thickness, leads of open water that appeared without warning, and pressure ridges threatening to lock the ship fast. Navigational charts offered guidance but could not predict sudden changes in the ice. Lookouts scanned constantly, noting patterns in the ice drift and subtle signs of stress in the ship's hull. Even brief miscalculations could result in disaster, and the tension among crew members was tempered by the unspoken understanding that each decision might decide life or death. Abandoned tents and scattered equipment testified to the relentless grip of the ice, and the relief party stepped carefully among the remnants of a journey gone awry. Sledging parties examined the frozen camps, piecing together what had occurred during the previous expedition's struggle. Personal belongings, half buried in snow, hinted at frantic attempts to survive. The silence was oppressive. No human voices remained to tell the tale, only footprints frozen into the ice that ended abruptly. Crew members were struck by the eerie juxtaposition of signs of life and the absolute emptiness of the surroundings, an Arctic void that seemed to absorb sound, movement, and hope in equal measure. Sudden gusts and freezing spray battered both men and the vessel, forcing constant vigilance as the Arctic seemed determined to punish even those seeking to save life. The Bear pitched and rolled in seas that alternated between open water and packed ice, with temperatures dropping to levels that made steel brittle and human fingers numb. Snowstorms reduced visibility to a few yards, and icy winds cut through layered clothing, forcing the crew to huddle and ration warmth. Each day brought new challenges, navigating through rapidly forming pressure ridges, maintaining engines in freezing conditions, and ensuring that sledges were not lost to the drift. In this environment, the line between heroic rescue and repeated tragedy was perilously thin. Teams advanced onto unstable floes, balancing hope against the treacherous ice that could split beneath their feet at any moment. Sledging parties carried provisions, first aid, and tools to reinforce tents or make emergency repairs, their movements cautious yet urgent. Ice cracked underfoot, snow-covered ridges threatened to topple sledges, and the hidden currents of the sea could shift flows away from the crew at any instant. Each step required awareness and agility, and the fear of plunging into freezing waters kept every man alert. The Arctic demanded both patience and audacity, rewarding skill with incremental progress while punishing overconfidence with swift consequences. Journal entries captured more than coordinates and weather. They spoke of exhausted limbs, fleeting relief, and the unrelenting tension of an Arctic mission that offered no guarantees. Crew members documented frostbite, the psychological strain of navigating hostile terrain, and the emotional weight of witnessing the remnants of the original Karluk expedition. Observations of shifting ice, faint animal tracks, and fleeting signs of survivors were recorded with meticulous care, often accompanied by reflections on mortality and the unforgiving nature of the polar environment. These accounts preserve not only logistical information, but also the human experience of confronting a wilderness that demanded respect and inspired dread in equal measure. The Bear narrowly escaped being trapped by shifting ice, and every maneuver, when to advance, when to retreat, was weighted with the knowledge that one misstep could claim lives. Hulls groaned under pressure, and rudder adjustments had to be precise to avoid catastrophic contact with unseen icebergs. Decisions about rationing fuel, deploying sledging parties, and timing movements through leads in the ice were constant calculations. Even with experienced hands at the helm, the Arctic environment exacted a toll. Tools were lost, provisions delayed, and crew morale challenged. Each successful mile gained was a quiet triumph, but the shadow of the prior Karluk tragedy never fully lifted from the minds of those aboard. Even after those rescued were secured, questions remained about those who had vanished entirely, leaving a haunting void across the frozen landscape. Some survivors of the Karluk disaster were recovered, their tales of endurance and hardship a testament to human resilience. Yet others had perished, their fates swallowed by drifting ice or frozen into obscurity. The Arctic offered no explanations, only fragments of evidence scattered across snowfields and frozen waters. For the relief expedition, the sense of accomplishment was tempered by grief and uncertainty, and the silent expanse around them seemed to retain memory of every peril faced and every life lost. Amid the endless white, the Arctic stood as a frozen witness to deeds of courage and the shadows of lives swallowed by ice. The mysterious fate of the USS Rogers, 1881. A shroud of mist hung low over the Chukchi Sea, and the USS Rogers cut silently through fractured ice, each crunch of the hull a reminder that the Arctic claimed attention before it granted passage. The ship, a steam-driven naval vessel, had been dispatched to follow up on the ill-fated Jeannette expedition, though its journey carried little certainty. From the earliest hours of navigation, officers and sailors alike understood that the sea, frozen in part and fluid in others, could offer guidance as easily as it could betray them. Every shift in wind or drift of ice was scrutinized with intense care, for in this remote polar region, even the most experienced mariners could find themselves trapped with no escape. Jagged floes shifted unpredictably around the vessel, and the crew moved with constant alertness, aware that even a single misstep could trap them in the unforgiving expanse. The ice was a puzzle that yielded no pattern, forming ridges and crevasses with little warning. Steam engines strained against the slow-moving ice, groaning beneath the effort to maintain momentum. The sailors worked tirelessly, clearing brine from frozen decks, repairing frayed ropes, and reinforcing the hull where cracks threatened to deepen. Each day brought new hazards, and the silent expanse seemed to test their endurance, measuring patience and resolve as much as skill. The flight of seabirds and the glint of distant icebergs offered subtle hints of land and open water, yet the Arctic remained a maze that offered no certainties. Crew members took careful note of every environmental sign, the direction of currents, the presence of whales surfacing in leads, and the colour of the sky at dawn. These small observations were vital, not only for navigation but for survival, for they hinted at the proximity of ice-free waters or hidden dangers. Even brief glimpses of the horizon were treated with caution. What appeared solid might shift within hours, and what seemed navigable could conceal crushing ice beneath deceptively calm surfaces. Pressure ridges pressed against the hull, and sudden gusts of frigid wind reminded the sailors that the sea's silence often preceded chaos. Snow and sleet reduced visibility, forcing the crew to rely on instinct and experience rather than sight. The engines struggled, and at times the Rogers seemed immobile, caught in a grip of ice that refused to relent. Crew members were forced to contend with frostbite and exhaustion, their movements slow and deliberate in temperatures that could numb hands and freeze steam pipes. In these conditions, even minor errors, a misjudged turn, a delayed maneuver, could have fatal consequences, and the Arctic allowed no room for oversight. Over time, reports of the Rogers grew fragmented and conflicting, as though the Arctic itself had obscured the ship from memory and record. Whalers, distant settlements, and passing vessels offered glimpses, sometimes a smoke plume on the horizon, sometimes nothing at all. Conflicting accounts painted a patchwork of possibilities. Some suggested the ship had been trapped and abandoned. Others hinted at brief sightings of crew parties moving along ice floes. Each report carried its own uncertainty, leaving naval officers and families of the crew in a limbo of hope and dread, wondering whether rescue remained possible or if all had been lost to the cold expanse. Scattered wreckage and frozen personal effects drifted ashore sporadically, each fragment a cryptic message that only deepened the mystery of what had become of the crew. Small boxes of supplies, a single boot, and remnants of navigational instruments appeared along the Siberian coast, often discovered months after the Rogers had vanished from sight. These fragments told a story of sudden struggle, of men contending with overwhelming conditions, but they provided no clear answers. Each recovered item was a reminder of the Arctic's indifferent power, a physical testament to the fragility of human endeavour against ice and storm. Some accounts suggest that small parties may have ventured onto ice floes or attempted to reach Siberian settlements, braving the same cold that had claimed so many before them. Such attempts would have required immense endurance, travelling across shifting ice, navigating partially hidden leads, and enduring near-constant exposure to frost and hunger. Some parties did likely survive for days, even weeks, only to vanish into the Arctic's vast emptiness. The combination of isolation, unpredictable ice drift, and scarce resources created a landscape where survival was never guaranteed, and every step toward potential safety was simultaneously a confrontation with imminent peril. Generations of researchers have pieced together what little can be confirmed, but the Arctic's silence preserves more questions than answers, leaving the Rogers story suspended between reality and legend. Naval reports, whalers' testimonies, and scattered evidence have been analysed and reanalysed, yet no comprehensive account exists. Historians continue to debate the most plausible scenarios, whether the ship sank intact, broke apart among floes, or whether crew members attempted over-ice travel to distant outposts. The story endures, not only as a record of vanished men and a lost vessel, but as a testament to the Arctic's ability to swallow events whole, leaving only fragments for posterity to interpret. Beneath shifting ice and the endless sweep of polar winds, the Rogers endures as a frozen enigma, its fate whispered only by the Arctic itself. The Lost Russian Brousiloff Expedition, 1912. Fractured floes stretched endlessly in every direction, and the Sviataya Anna slowly became part of the shifting mosaic, its timbers groaning under the subtle pressure of the Arctic ice. Captain Georgy Brousiloff had led the expedition from Arkhangelsk with the intention of navigating the northeastern passage along the Siberian coast. Yet, from the earliest days, the ice revealed itself as an unpredictable adversary. Crew members peered through icy fogs at vast white plains where horizon and sky blended, and each movement of the ship was a negotiation with forces far larger than their own. The schooner's rigging creaked and shivered as the pack ice pressed against its hull, a reminder that even the sturdiest vessel was at the mercy of the polar environment. As the days lengthened, the ice tightened around the schooner, bending railings and pressing on the hull with a relentless patience that offered no mercy to those aboard. Pressure ridges formed without warning, forcing crews to cut channels or reinforce the ship's timbers with whatever materials were at hand. The groan of metal and timber became a constant companion, a soundtrack to the uncertainty and tension that spread among the men. Even small miscalculations in navigation risked crushing the hull against the shifting floes, and every action required precision, patience, and endurance under extreme cold. The Arctic demanded vigilance at every hour, and lapses could not be afforded. Crewmen marked the passage of time by the rotation of storms and the careful rationing of dwindling provisions, each day measured in snowdrifts and frozen decks rather than hours. Meals were meagre, supplies dwindling with each passing week, and the monotony of frozen imprisonment weighed heavily on both officers and sailors. Sledges were prepared for a possible escape over ice, yet the uncertainty of distance, terrain, and survival made each plan a tentative exercise in hope. Storms could appear without warning, winds lashing the deck and ice shifting beneath their feet, reminding the crew that the Arctic yielded nothing freely, and survival was always provisional. Whispers of dissent grew among the frozen rigging and dimly lit cabins as hope and frustration intertwined, testing Captain Brousiloff's authority against the pressure of endless isolation. Some argued for immediate over-ice travel to distant settlements, while others insisted on remaining aboard, relying on the vessel as a fragile refuge. Tensions ran high as men contended with hunger, frostbite, and the claustrophobic confines of the ship. Decision-making became a delicate balance between risk and prudence, with each choice potentially separating life from death. The psychological toll was as punishing as the environmental hazards, and unity among the crew was constantly strained by fear and fatigue. Weeks passed without a glimpse of open water, and the schooner drifted further into a white void where the horizon dissolved into ice and sky, leaving the crew cut off from the world. Communications with other ships or settlements were impossible, and the relentless drift carried them away from known routes. Each day the men realized more keenly the isolation that had engulfed them, with the Arctic's monotone expanse leaving no reference points, only the ceaseless interplay of light, ice, and shadow. The sense of direction became elusive, and with it, the certainty of survival. Valerian Albanov stepped onto the shifting ice with a small group, each man carrying the weight of hunger, frostbite, and the uncertain hope that they might survive the frozen expanse. They travelled over unpredictable ice, negotiating pressure ridges, leads of open water, and hidden crevasses. Starvation and exhaustion stalked every step, yet Albanov meticulously recorded each day in a journal that would become the sole first-hand account of the doomed expedition. The crew who remained aboard the Sviataya Anna vanished into obscurity, leaving only traces of clothing, equipment and scattered notes carried by the few who survived. Albanov's memoirs reveal the psychological and physical extremes endured in the face of relentless ice and wind. Artifacts occasionally washed ashore decades later, silent fragments of a doomed voyage that offered glimpses of courage, misfortune, and the Arctic's indifferent hand. A single boot, a length of rope, or a damaged tool told partial stories of men struggling against insurmountable odds. These objects, recovered along distant Siberian shores or drifting among ice floes, provided tantalizing but incomplete evidence of the expedition's final days. Scholars and historians pieced together theories from these fragments, yet the broader picture remained elusive, and the true fate of the Sviataya Anna and most of her crew remained an enigma locked in frozen time. Historians have pieced together fragments of the journey from Albanov's memoirs and sparse relics, but the true story of the Sviataya Anna remains shrouded beneath drifting ice, its secrets locked away by time and cold. The expedition became a cautionary tale of the Arctic's ability to consume ambition, navigation, and human endurance. The relentless drift, the vast emptiness, and the impossibility of rescue created a narrative suspended between fact and legend. Even modern exploration has revealed little, with only sporadic discoveries providing hints of what occurred in the early months of the ship's doomed journey through the Kara Sea and beyond. Within the frozen reaches of the Arctic, the Sviataya Anna rests, a silent witness to the men it carried and the fate it sealed. The vanishing of the Baldwin-Ziegler expedition camp, 1901. Snow and ice stretched to the horizon as the Baldwin-Ziegler expedition pitched its camp. A small cluster of tents and supplies standing defiantly against the vast polar emptiness. The camp had been established on Franz Josef Land, serving as a staging point for what was intended to be a bold push toward the North Pole. Equipped with provisions, sledges, and the most modern Arctic gear of the day, the men set to work in the long polar day, securing tents, rationing supplies, and marking routes for their sledging parties. From the first hours, however, the stark isolation and unyielding environment of the Arctic were impossible to ignore. The silence of the ice and the occasional groan of shifting floes suggested a world in which human endeavour was fragile, temporary, and perhaps irrelevant. Gales swept across the frozen landscape, bending tent poles and forcing men to dig trenches in shifting snow to protect their fragile shelters. The wind carried needles of ice across their faces, and even the sturdiest shelters threatened to collapse under the relentless assault. Crews laboured tirelessly, their hands frozen and faces wind-chapped, as each day demanded careful attention to prevent disaster. Provisions were rationed with strict discipline, yet even careful planning could not overcome the capricious force of the Arctic elements. Every task, from melting ice for water to securing sledges, became a battle against both environment and time, leaving the men exhausted but painfully aware of their vulnerability. Footprints appeared in the drifting snow only to vanish without a trace, and strange shadows seemed to flit across the ice in the long Arctic twilight. Some men reported hearing distant noises, faint echoes that carried across the flat frozen terrain, though no human presence could be confirmed. On clear nights, auroras danced overhead, their spectral light casting the snow in shifting colours that played tricks on tired eyes. The isolation and monotony began to weigh heavily, fostering a sense of unease that was difficult to articulate. Even small irregularities, a misplaced tool or the sudden absence of a sled dog, became ominous signs, magnified by the relentless whiteness and silence of the polar landscape. One by one, men failed to return from short excursions, leaving companions to wonder if the ice had swallowed them or if some unseen force guided them away. Sledging parties set out to reconnoitre nearby islands or to retrieve supplies, and in several cases individuals simply vanished. Search efforts were undertaken immediately, yet the vastness of the Arctic and the ever-shifting ice rendered these attempts largely futile. The remaining men were forced to balance caution with necessity, knowing that delay could mean their own disappearance. Rumours and conjecture began circulating through the camp, and with each passing day the sense of imminent danger became nearly tangible, a shadow over every decision and action. When relief parties finally reached the site, the camp was empty. Tents collapsed, supplies scattered, and no human voice disturbed the Arctic silence. Some of the structures had been partially buried under fresh snowdrifts, while others were simply abandoned, doors swinging loosely in the wind. Sledges and provisions were left behind as if the men had simply walked away into the white expanse. Later explorers noted the eerie absence of any signs of struggle, which only deepened the enigma. Nothing pointed definitively to storm, accident, or misjudgment. The camp had become a ghostly monument to human ambition, halted by forces beyond comprehension. Scholars debated whether sudden storms, hidden crevasses, or human misjudgment had forced the men into the void, yet no theory fully explained their vanishing. The Arctic is notorious for concealing its secrets, and in this case, the environment may have erased almost every clue. Some historians proposed that snowdrifts could have engulfed tents overnight, leaving men disoriented and separated, while others suggested the possibility of sudden ice fractures or unseen crevasses opening in the pack. Even considering these possibilities, the swiftness and completeness of the disappearance left unanswered questions, emphasizing the Arctic's indifference to human effort. Pieces of journals and abandoned equipment found years later revealed glimpses of what might have occurred, but each clue deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. A weathered notebook hinted at dwindling rations and harsh winds, while a sledging boot found miles from the camp suggested desperate travel across the ice. Artifacts recovered sporadically by later expeditions revealed meticulous planning, but also the limits of human endurance when confronted with isolation, cold, and uncertainty. The meagre evidence sparked speculation and imagination, yet no definitive account could reconstruct the final days of the Baldwin-Ziegler camp. Secrets cling tightly to the Arctic, and the camp that once bore the hopes of men now survives only in speculation, whispers, and the eternal hush of ice. Over a century later, explorers, historians, and adventurers continue to debate what fate befell the men, imagining scenarios ranging from sudden storms to disorientation and exhaustion. The story of the Baldwin-Ziegler expedition camp remains a cautionary tale of ambition confronted by the Arctic's vastness, illustrating how even the best equipped and most determined parties can vanish without a trace. Every clue uncovered seems only to amplify the sense of a lost world, suspended in frozen time and inhospitable silence. Even now, the Arctic conceals the Baldwin-Ziegler camp beneath its shifting ice, leaving only echoes of ambition and the unanswered fate of those who once stood there. The fatal end of the Greely expedition, 1881. The frozen inlet of Lady Franklin Bay received the Greely expedition with an austere welcome, its ice-strewn shores offering both a base and a silent warning of the trials ahead. Lieutenant Adolphus Greely and his men had arrived with high hopes as part of the United States contribution to the first International Polar Year, tasked with conducting meteorological, astronomical, and magnetic observations in one of the most forbidding regions on Earth. Fort Conger was constructed as their headquarters, a small collection of tents and huts braced against the relentless Arctic winds. From the outset, the men faced an environment both majestic and hostile, where every decision carried weighty consequences. Despite careful preparation, the sheer scale of the ice fields and the merciless climate foreshadowed the immense challenges that lay ahead. Amid the stark whiteness, the men devoted themselves to precise meteorological observations and astronomical measurements, their scientific zeal undimmed by the Arctic's biting chill. Instruments were calibrated with meticulous care, data meticulously recorded, and routines adhered to with military precision. For months, the team maintained an impressive schedule, conducting observations across the barren landscape and reporting their findings to a world far removed from the polar silence. Yet even in these early successes, the isolation imposed a psychological strain, and the men slowly became aware that their survival depended on more than discipline alone. It demanded constant vigilance against both nature and fatigue. As the long polar night descended, even the most disciplined among them felt the weight of isolation, the darkness stretching endlessly across both sky and spirit. Days merged into weeks, and the perpetual twilight seemed to distort the passage of time. The Arctic cold penetrated even the thickest layers of clothing, and small errors or missteps were amplified by the harsh conditions. Cabin fever began to make itself felt, and tensions occasionally flared over rationing or work assignments. Every creak of the ice, every distant groan from the frozen landscape carried an unsettling resonance, a reminder that the environment was omnipresent and unyielding. The men faced not only the physical threat of the Arctic, but also the creeping erosion of morale in a world defined by white emptiness. Messages of delayed resupply brought grim news, and with each passing week, provisions dwindled while the Arctic ice refused to yield to human schedules. Relief ships, impeded by shifting ice and treacherous channels, could not reach Fort Conger as planned, leaving the men to ration supplies with increasing precision. Sledges packed for scouting and hunting missions were carefully accounted for, yet even the most organised efforts could not forestall the reality of scarcity. Anxiety became a constant companion, and every sight of distant ice ridges prompted questions. Would they be able to survive until rescue arrived, or would the Arctic claim them first? Frostbite, scurvy, and relentless hunger gnawed at the men, turning every journey across the ice into an ordeal that tested the limits of endurance. Hunting parties often returned empty-handed, and attempts to forage along the frozen coastline yielded little sustenance. Food became precious not only for its caloric value, but also for its psychological reassurance, and the knowledge that every bite could mean life or death intensified the pressure. Bodies weakened under the dual strain of extreme cold and malnutrition, while minds grew restless, weighed down by anxiety and the monotony of white landscapes. Survival had become the sole focus, and even the most skilled observers found their abilities impaired by exhaustion. One by one, the expedition's members succumbed to the unforgiving elements, and the chain of command frayed under the pressure of despair and loss. Disease and exposure claimed their toll with relentless precision, and morale plummeted as friends and colleagues vanished into the white desolation. Difficult decisions, whether to send out scouting parties, ration food further, or move the camp, strained leadership and tested the discipline that had been a hallmark of the mission. Even small setbacks, such as the loss of equipment or the death of a single dog team, had cascading effects on both survival and morale. The men confronted the Arctic's indifference with courage, but human strength proved limited against such vast impersonal forces. When the relief ships finally broke through the ice, they found survivors barely clinging to life, their bodies emaciated and spirits fractured, leaving behind evidence of the relentless Arctic toll. Only 7 men remained of the original 25 who had wintered at Fort Conger, and the stories they recounted were harrowing accounts of endurance, deprivation, and loss. Abandoned sledges, scattered provisions, and frozen journals bore silent witness to the suffering endured. While Greely and his men had documented invaluable scientific data, the cost of survival had been almost total, and the stark reality of their ordeal reverberated in every detail recovered by the rescue teams. Though scientific data and observations were ultimately preserved, the human cost of the Greely expedition overshadowed all achievement, a sobering testament to nature's indifference. The Arctic had claimed its due, not through sudden disappearance or mystery, but through the inexorable accumulation of hardship, deprivation, and human fragility. Every artifact, journal, and observation is a reminder of what was accomplished amid unimaginable adversity, and of the lives that were lost in pursuit of knowledge. The story of the Greely expedition stands as both a scientific milestone and a cautionary tale, demonstrating how ambition can meet tragedy when confronted with the Arctic's uncompromising reality. In Lady Franklin Bay, the frozen silence seems to keep the echoes of Greely's men, a stark reminder that the Arctic preserves its secrets as jealously as it does its cold. The tragic death march of the Sedov expedition, 1912. The winter of 1912 settled heavily over the Kara Sea, and the men of the Sedov expedition found themselves trapped in a landscape that seemed to swallow sound as easily as it claimed warmth. Their vessel, the Sviataya Anna, had become fixed in the drifting pack ice north of Franz Josef Land, and the dream of pushing toward the pole had shifted into a quiet struggle for survival. What had begun as a bold Russian attempt to establish new routes through the Arctic quickly turned into a season of dim skies, failing rations, and an unease that grew heavier with each mile they drifted, for it soon became clear that the ice was carrying them farther into desolation, rather than closer to any known coast. Months of immobilization eroded both supplies and resolve, and Captain Georgy Brousiloff, more determined than fearful, decided that only a departure across the ice offered the faintest hope. It was navigator Valerian Albanov, trained in celestial navigation and experienced in Arctic sledging, who prepared a small group for what he believed would be a grueling but manageable journey toward Alexandra Land. Diaries later recovered described the exhaustion of that preparation, where men wrapped fur boots with strips of canvas until their fingers bled, and the deck of the trapped vessel echoed with the hollow thuds of crates being dragged up through the hatches. The cold had already warped their compasses, frostbitten several crewmen, and caused the lamp oil to thicken into a sluggish slurry. Yet Albanov wrote of a strange calm that settled over the party, as if the ice itself were urging them to depart. The drifting floes proved far less stable than expected, and the first days of their march were marked by sudden cracks that opened without warning beneath their sledges. Polar bears shadowed their movement, sometimes appearing at the edge of visibility as pale outlines that vanished when the wind shifted. These encounters left the party uneasy, for the animals seemed neither curious nor hungry, but watchful, almost as though following the slow procession of men and dogs across the darkening plain. What the explorers had imagined as a steady route toward the archipelago turned instead into a maze of pressure ridges that forced them into detours spanning miles, each diversion costing time and precious food. The underlying tension among the group deepened when Captain Brousiloff, long afflicted by illness and isolation aboard the ship, refused to join the sledging party yet insisted he would eventually attempt his own journey. His behaviour had reportedly changed during the months of entrapment, marked by sudden bouts of silence followed by directives that contradicted earlier orders. These hints of instability, mentioned in both Albanov's account and later retellings, created an invisible fracture within the expedition, for no one knew whether the captain's condition had been born of fever, despair, or the creeping disorientation many Arctic explorers described when sunlight dwindled for too long. Progress across the ice became an ordeal measured in hours rather than miles, and the brutal churn of late winter storms erased their tracks almost as soon as they made them. The party witnessed odd atmospheric effects that Albanov later recorded with a mixture of curiosity and dread, including halos around the sun that seemed unnaturally bright and a shimmering glow along the horizon that flickered as if mimicking distant lanterns. Some crew members believed the lights marked the coastline they desperately sought, while others whispered that they were illusions created by hunger. These mirages strained morale, for each false glimmer lifted hope only to extinguish it moments later. Days stretched into weeks, and the survivors began to ration crumbs of black bread and spoonfuls of rancid pemmican. One man grew so delirious that he spoke of hearing voices beneath the ice, claiming they echoed like muffled footsteps moving in the opposite direction of their march. Another insisted that distant shapes were travelling parallel to them, just beyond the curtain of blowing snow. Albanov, whose discipline never wavered in his writing, described these episodes with detachment, yet his phrasing hinted at a deeper concern that the Arctic silence was playing tricks even on him. Their journey, already perilous, was becoming shadowed by something more intangible than cold or hunger. Eventually the party reached a region where the ice fractured into channels of open water. They constructed crude kayaks from canvas and spare timber, their hands trembling as they stitched seams made stiff from frost. Crossing these leads forced them into a rhythm where each man paddled in short bursts, while the others pushed the flimsy craft from behind, the sound of cracking floes echoing through the still air. One crossing ended in disaster when a kayaker lost his footing and vanished beneath a sudden collapse, his cries silenced almost instantly by the freezing water. The loss shook the group, for they had reached a point where every death meant abandoning not only a companion, but irreplaceable gear. When exhaustion threatened to stop them entirely, Albanov and the remaining men stumbled across the faint outline of Alexandra Land. The island offered no relief from the cold, yet its dark ridges rising above the ice gave them a destination more tangible than drifting floes. Human presence seemed possible here, and they scanned the shoreline for smoke or signs of older expeditions. Instead, they found scattered remnants of previous camps, including a weathered cairn containing scraps of paper too faded to read. These relics unsettled the party, for they hinted not only at earlier attempts to cross this same region, but also at how easily those attempts had been lost to time. As the group pressed inland, they realised that several of the strongest men were beginning to weaken without a clear cause. Some walked in unsteady zigzags even when the ground lay flat, while others drifted into long silences that seemed to deepen with every hour. Their deterioration was too rapid for simple malnutrition, and Albanov speculated about scurvy or hidden infections, yet the timing felt uncanny, occurring just as the worst cold began to break. One night, shortly before they finally reached Cape Flora, a crew member collapsed without warning and could not be revived. His skin showed no distinct sign of frostbite, nor was there injury to explain his sudden death, leaving the others shaken and increasingly aware of how fragile their hold on survival had become. The rescue that eventually brought Albanov and one companion to safety could not erase the questions left behind on the ice. Brousiloff and the rest of the men who remained aboard the Sviataya Anna were never seen again, and the drifting path of the ship was later reconstructed only through scattered reports of debris found along remote coastlines. Historians speculated about starvation, illness, and a ship crushed silently during the night, yet none of these answers accounted for the strange behaviours noted in the final weeks of the march or the unexplained death that haunted their memories of the journey. From within the vast emptiness of the polar wastes, the unanswered silence of the Sviataya Anna still waits in the darkness. The last days of the Sverdrup Aurora expedition, 1917. The first clues to the final days of the Sverdrup Aurora expedition surfaced in a weather-stained notebook recovered from a fractured floe north of Svalbard, its pages stiff with frost and its ink blurred into wavering lines that suggested hurried hands and failing light. What survived of the entries seemed to capture a precarious balance between methodical, scientific purpose and an environment quietly shifting toward danger, leaving behind a record as fragmented as the ice that had swallowed their camp. Although much about the expedition was lost with the men themselves, these early fragments hinted at a story shaped by calculation, pressure, and a creeping sense that the world around them was beginning to turn in ways their instruments could not fully track. It was only after officials compared the notebook with scattered equipment recovered months later that the mystery of their final hours began to take shape. From the scattered entries that survived, it became clear that the scientists had spent their last stable days following a precise rhythm of measurements and observations, using auroral cameras mounted on spindly tripods and magnetic compasses calibrated for minute fluctuations in the polar field. In the winter of 1917, Norway's interest in upper atmospheric research had drawn small parties northward, and the men on the Aurora had been tasked with collecting data during a season of unusually strong geomagnetic storms. Their logs recorded careful nightly exposures of the sky, the timing of each flare of green or violet light above the horizon, and adjustments made to their delicate photographic shutters. As the temperature dropped past levels their equipment had been designed to withstand. Nothing in those early pages hinted at fear or uncertainty, yet faint descriptions of tremors beneath the ice and distant booms drifting through the stillness appeared with increasing regularity, as if the expedition had begun to sense a pattern that eluded explanation. In the brittle pages that recorded their final week, the handwriting grew tense as the team noted a series of disturbances they could not explain, beginning with erratic compass swings that forced them to recalibrate their magnetic station twice in a single night. One entry described a sudden ripple running beneath the floe, followed by the sound of something cracking far beyond their lantern light, a slow fracture that echoed like a distant cannon. Another page mentioned an auroral curtain that stretched unusually low across the sky, casting flickering shadows that seemed to shift with a rhythm none of them recognized. They recorded a faint glow on the sea's horizon, a point of light they thought might belong to a ship, though wartime restrictions made it unlikely that any vessel would be sailing so far from established routes. Even stranger was the final note. Voices on the wind again, faint, unsure. It stood alone on the page without elaboration. Whatever struck their camp did so with a force both sudden and disorienting, scattering equipment in patterns that did not fully align with a simple ice pressure surge, leaving a scene that seemed shaped by overlapping movements rather than one violent moment. When investigators later examined the site, they found the principal tripod snapped cleanly midway down the leg, folded inward as though struck from above. The expedition's crates of photographic plates had burst open and spilled across the ice, yet many remained unbroken, suggesting that the force had been angled rather than explosive. One of the men's heavy boots stood upright where it had frozen in place, positioned as though someone had stepped out of it in haste. Most puzzling was the tent. Its front section had been peeled back, but its rear poles were embedded deeper into the ice than before, driven downward by pressure rather than torn outward by wind. Every detail pointed toward chaos, yet none perfectly matched the known behaviour of shifting ridges. Long after their final log entry, faint reports from trawlers and drifting crews hinted that movement had been seen where no men were expected to survive, beginning with a Soviet fishing crew who later claimed to have heard whistles north of Nordaustlandet 3 days after the expedition's final signal. Another unverified account came from a Norwegian trawler whose crew reported silhouettes crossing a broken floe near the edge of the pack, though the figures vanished before a second observer could confirm them. Weeks later, a small lifeboat was found half frozen into coastal ice near Kvitoya, with no oars, no provisions removed, and no footprints surrounding it. Experts determined the boat had not drifted from the camp but had been launched, meaning at least one of the men had still been alive after the ice collapse. Yet the absence of tracks around the boat suggested it had arrived there during a storm when winds erased every sign of the journey. When a Norwegian search party eventually reached the site, they discovered a tableau of interrupted tasks frozen beneath drifting snow, as if the men had been seized mid-routine by something they barely had time to acknowledge. A lantern still half filled with unused kerosene lay beside a box of untouched matches. A sled rested beside a narrow channel partially loaded with scientific gear and food, positioned as though one of the men had been preparing to move the essentials before abandoning the effort. A notebook was found open to a page listing upcoming auroral activity predictions for the week following the disaster, implying that they had expected to continue their work. Even the cooking pot they recovered still held ice-solid remnants of a meal that appeared to have been prepared only hours before the camp was destroyed. Despite cataloguing every object and marking every broken line of ice, investigators found themselves unable to assemble a conclusion that matched the evidence, leaving the incident suspended between natural catastrophe and something less definable. The ice could have shifted in multiple waves, but the patterns of collapse did not support a single pressure event, and the divergent directions of the fractures suggested competing forces. Records of auroral disturbances might explain the compass anomalies, yet they could not account for the booms beneath the floe or the persistent accounts of distant voices carried on the wind. Most troubling was the absence of the men themselves. No bodies, no torn clothing, no discarded gear from a final struggle. It was as though they had stepped beyond the edge of the ice and vanished. And over the riven expanse north of Nordaustlandet, it is said that faint traces of their vanished lights still shimmer where no footsteps remain. The Fokker Polar Flight Disaster, 1928. Above the shifting white expanse of the Arctic, the Fokker Polar Flight of 1928 traced a fragile path toward a horizon that seemed both endless and unknowable. The aircraft, a Fokker F.7B/3M, cut through thin air over an ocean of ice floes and frozen ridges, its engines humming a constant anxious rhythm. The men aboard had departed with the promise of charting unexplored routes across the polar north, confident that their machine and skill could bridge the vast emptiness below. Yet the Arctic, indifferent to ambition, spread beneath them a landscape of silence and reflection, where the ice glimmered in fractured sunlight and auroral bands danced like faint whispers across the sky. Inside the cramped fuselage, the crew moved with practiced precision, aware that every adjustment could mean the difference between discovery and disappearance. The pilot checked instruments that were prone to frostbite, the navigator measured angles with a sextant pressed against the small window, and the radio operator toggled frequencies, attempting to maintain contact with base stations hundreds of miles away. Each man understood that their mission was unprecedented, not merely a flight across known ice, but a scientific reconnaissance that demanded the collection of meteorological data, ice thickness readings, and aerial photographs of features that had never been mapped. Their task combined daring with methodical care, and every decision was weighted by the extreme environment enveloping them. For the first hours, the Arctic sky appeared deceptively calm, with sunlight glinting off distant ice floes and auroras, painting the clouds in restless streaks of green and violet. The engine's vibration mingled with the subtle creak of stressed metal, a reminder that even well-built aircraft were fragile in these conditions. The frozen world below offered both guidance and menace. Channels of open water glimmered like narrow mirrors, Snowdrifts shifted in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, and distant mountains, when glimpsed, appeared like ghostly sentinels. The crew logged their observations meticulously, noting the behaviour of wind currents, ice movement, and cloud formations. Yet a tension grew alongside their fascination, a quiet acknowledgement that the Arctic had its own rules. When the radio crackled with the expedition's final message, it was brief, fragmented, and shrouded in static, leaving operators grasping for meaning that never fully arrived. All instruments functioning, visibility dropping, course uncertain, the message hinted at urgency without detail. Ground stations scrambled to respond, yet the signals were inconsistent, their strength ebbing like tides, leaving only bursts of cryptic words. Even the seasoned radio operators struggled to interpret the cadence, the pauses, and the final silence, a silence that would become the most enduring clue to the aircraft's fate. That single transmission captured both the hope of exploration and the first brush with the unknowable forces arrayed against them. The weather shifted without warning, folding the sky into sheets of white, while icy gusts shook the wings and crept through every seam of the plane's fuselage. Visibility dropped to mere meters, and the horizon vanished into a swirling mass of snow and cloud. Frost formed along the leading edges of the wings, glinting like fragile crystal knives, while the engines laboured in the cold, their performance diminished by temperatures far below what engineers had anticipated. The pilot struggled to maintain altitude, the navigator attempted fixes through the haze, and the radio operator's calls fell into static that carried only fragments of sound. The aircraft, once a symbol of human ingenuity, became a fragile silhouette in a storm that neither machine nor man could fully command. Weeks later, ships and aircraft combed the drifting ice, finding fragments of metal and fabric scattered across miles, each clue more enigmatic than the last. Pieces of the fuselage were discovered atop pressure ridges bent at impossible angles, while personal belongings, boots, journals, a leather flight helmet, lay on floes seemingly untouched, as if the crew had vanished in mid-motion. One photograph, partially developed, depicted a frozen expanse with a faint glimmer of the Fokker's shadow, leaving analysts puzzled over the camera's orientation and exposure. Every recovered fragment confirmed the disaster had occurred somewhere in that vast and shifting field of ice, yet none provided a definitive explanation for the aircraft's final descent. Despite the meticulous records and the sporadic signs of their passage, no explanation accounted for the aircraft's vanishing, leaving only questions adrift in the polar expanse. Historians considered engine failure, structural collapse from frost accumulation, and disorientation caused by whiteout conditions, yet none of these factors fully explained the cryptic final transmission or the placement of wreckage over hundreds of square miles. Some proposed that sudden wind shear or auroral electrical phenomena might have played a role, influencing navigation or even the instruments themselves. Others speculated that the Fokker had attempted an emergency landing on a broken ice floe, only to be swallowed by open water moments later. In every case, the Arctic retained its silence, allowing theory but no certainty. Whispers tell of the Fokker's engines, their final echoes drifting silently on the Arctic wind beneath the shimmering auroras. The fate of the Danish Alabama expedition, 1909. Beneath a pall of pale winter light, the Danish Alabama expedition pushed northward, unaware that the ice itself might dictate their fate. The frozen landscape stretched endlessly, an indifferent expanse of snow, fractured ridges, and hidden crevasses that challenged every step. The team's goal had been ambitious: to map stretches of northeast Greenland that no Dane had yet charted, to record the coastal topography, and to gather meteorological and geological observations that might expand understanding of the Arctic frontier. Yet as the days passed, the relentless cold and shifting ice hinted that nature would have its own say in their plans. Each horizon seemed to hold a question the men could not answer, a blank page waiting for a story they might never complete. The small crew, a mix of seasoned sailors and young scientists, carried the hope of mapping stretches of Greenland no Dane had yet charted. Among them were men trained in navigation, survey techniques, and Arctic survival, yet even their experience could not fully prepare them for the isolation and uncertainty they faced. Supplies were rationed meticulously, tents and sledges packed with care, and instruments calibrated for the extremes of the polar north. Leadership rested in the hands of officers who understood the precariousness of the journey, aware that every decision, from rationing meals to choosing a route across the ice, could determine who survived and who did not. The men relied on each other not only for skill but for sanity, trusting in a fragile cohesion that the Arctic could easily unsettle. From the first days, they contended with drifting pack ice that buckled beneath their sledges and winds that tore at even the sturdiest tents. Frostbite claimed fingers and noses faster than expected, and blizzards struck without warning, forcing hurried excavations of snow-buried tents and supplies. The men measured the ice, tested its stability, and plotted courses that seemed promising one hour and impassable the next. Even the strongest sled dogs struggled with hidden crevasses and uneven terrain, slowing progress and exhausting their handlers. Each minor success was tempered by the knowledge that one misstep could mean hours of lost effort or worse, a fall into a hidden chasm. Snowdrifts formed overnight into jagged walls, forcing detours and making the familiar landscape unfamiliar from one day to the next. As provisions dwindled and frostbite crept along fingers and toes, disagreements over leadership and strategy began to fracture the party. Some advocated pushing farther along the ice to reach potential rescue points, while others insisted on waiting for favourable conditions that might never arrive. Arguments, once brief and contained, began to escalate, and a sense of paranoia settled over the group. Reports of missing tools, ration packets opened and left behind, and unexplained noises across the ice heightened tension. Crew members whispered of distant cries carried by the wind, footsteps in the snow that disappeared as soon as they were noticed, and strange ripples in the ice that seemed to shift when no one was near. The expedition's original purpose, a cooperative endeavour of discovery, gradually gave way to suspicion, fear, and an unspoken question: who among them could still be trusted to lead? One by one, crew members vanished from sight, leaving behind scattered gear and journals whose entries grew increasingly erratic. A sledge might be found abandoned, its cargo partially unloaded, the footprints leading to a ridge only to disappear into snowdrifts. Tents were discovered ripped open, some stakes broken, others still frozen upright, as if the owners had simply evaporated. The journals hinted at confusion and exhaustion, with terse notations about disappearing companions, unsteady footing, and strange observations of the ice itself. Ice that seemed to shift beneath their feet in unnatural ways. Each page suggested fear, uncertainty, and a slow dissolution of order, leaving investigators after the fact to puzzle over whether misfortune, misjudgment, or something more enigmatic had claimed them. Those who remained tried to hunt seals and set temporary camps, yet the shifting ice and blinding snow made every step precarious. Improvised shelters offered little protection against the wind, and the scarcity of food forced desperate decisions about how far to travel or which supplies to share. Some attempts to move sledges across thin ice ended with men nearly falling into freezing channels, forcing retreats that cost precious time and energy. Small accidents, an overturned sled, a broken sled runner, a lost ice pick, could cascade into life-threatening delays. The crew's morale frayed, yet a few remained determined to continue, driven by the faint hope of reaching a known coastal outpost or catching sight of a passing ship. Their efforts, methodical yet increasingly desperate, highlighted both human resilience and vulnerability in the face of the Arctic's relentless indifference. The environment itself seemed to conspire against them. Arctic fog rolled in with a thickness that muffled sound, making companions appear and disappear in ghostly silhouettes. Strange reflections of auroras on the ice created illusions of movement that turned men against their own eyes. Even the tides of the Greenland Sea could carry away sledges or markers in a single night, erasing paths they had relied upon. Every day the landscape shifted in ways both predictable and inexplicable, and the men began to write of feelings that they could not fully articulate. The ice watching, the wind whispering, and the snow concealing truths that would never be revealed. By the time search parties reached the northern reaches of King Frederick VIII Land, all that remained were half-buried sledges, tattered tents, and a silence that seemed to mock the expedition's ambitions. Pieces of clothing protruded from snowdrifts, notebooks lay open with faded ink, and instruments intended to chart longitude and latitude were scattered beyond recognition. Even the sled dogs, long missing, were hinted at only by faint tracks buried under new snow. Every detail suggested a sudden unravelling, yet the precise sequence of events remained beyond reconstruction. Investigators pieced together theories of separation, exhaustion, or misadventure on unstable ice. But certainty remained elusive. The land and sea had claimed the expedition, leaving only fragments to testify to its existence. Along the frozen coastlines of northeast Greenland, the faint traces of the Alabama expedition linger, whispering secrets the ice has refused to release. The lost Swedish balloon expedition of Salomon Andrée, 1897. On a pale July morning in 1897, the Swedish balloon expedition led by Salomon Andrée ascended into the Arctic sky, its hydrogen-filled envelope shimmering in the fragile sunlight. Below stretched a vast expanse of drifting ice, fractured by ridges and dotted with scattered icebergs that gleamed like broken mirrors. The air was crisp, almost unnaturally still, carrying the faint scent of frozen salt and snow. For Andrée and his companions, this ascent was both a triumph of ambition and a plunge into uncertainty. The Arctic promised both unparalleled discovery and the ever-present possibility of disaster. From the moment the awning lifted, the men understood that the success of their mission depended on fragile calculations, a merciless environment, and a degree of luck no human could command. Within the wicker basket, Andrée, Knut Frankel, and Niels Strindberg moved carefully among instruments, ropes, and photographic equipment, each aware of the delicate balance keeping them aloft. Frankel checked the drag ropes that barely allowed for steering, while Strindberg arranged photographic plates, intent on capturing the ice formations far below. Andrée monitored a barometer, recording every subtle shift in air pressure and wind direction. The balloon itself was a technological marvel for its time, but still perilously vulnerable. A minor puncture could release hydrogen, and shifting weather could toss them hundreds of miles off course. Every task required precision, every movement weighed by the possibility of catastrophe, and every glance downward reminded them of the ice's indifferent expanse. For hours, the balloon drifted silently over ice floes and scattered icebergs, the Arctic expanse stretching endlessly beneath them, both beautiful and unforgiving. Sunlight fractured across the snow, turning ordinary ridges into stark, otherworldly sculptures. The crew documented everything, noting the patterns of drifting ice, the occasional lead of open water, and the shadows of distant glaciers. Beneath them, the ice moved in slow, imperceptible rhythms, sometimes compressing into jagged pressure ridges, other times opening into channels that promised no safe landing. The balloon floated above, a fragile speck against a landscape that refused to be tamed or understood. Even in these early hours, the crew sensed that the Arctic's vastness was not merely physical, but almost sentient, challenging their every calculation. A sudden fog bank rolled across the ice, reducing visibility to nothing, while the wind shifted unpredictably, forcing the crew to adjust drag ropes and make impossible calculations on the fly. The temperature dropped sharply, and the condensation froze along the balloon's envelope, creating delicate crystalline patterns that glinted in the fleeting light. Every movement was fraught. Misjudging the drag ropes could lead to a collision with unseen ice, and every change in wind carried them farther from the route planned months before. The men's journals recorded terse entries about the disorientation, about the muffled sounds of creaking ropes, and about strange optical illusions on the ice below, floating ridges and shadowed channels that seemed to shift when observed from different angles. Days passed, and the expedition found itself carried farther from its intended course, the ice below offering no refuge, and the balloon's fragile frame creaking under strain. Even the most careful observations could not prevent the gradual drift northeast. Driven by currents the crew could neither see nor control. Supplies were rationed meticulously, but the constant motion and tension of maintaining altitude wore on both body and mind. At night, auroras glimmered across the horizon, casting eerie lights that reflected off the ice in disorienting patterns. The balloon's wicker basket creaked with every gust, and the men became acutely aware that their fate rested on elements far beyond human mastery: the Arctic wind, the hidden structure of the ice below, and the limits of their fragile craft. As reports from their logs dwindled to fragmented notes, the Arctic seemed to close around them, a landscape indifferent to human ambition and unyielding in its secrets. entries became brief, almost cryptic, recording shifts in wind, sudden drops in temperature, and moments when the balloon dipped dangerously close to jagged ice ridges. Frankel noted that the drag ropes had torn, reducing their ability to maneuver. Strindberg wrote about fog so dense that the ice below vanished entirely. Andrée's final entries suggested a resigned determination, a commitment to continue despite the impossible odds. Each note, sparse and precise, testified to the tension of isolation, the constant threat of disaster, and the mystery of a journey in which no one could know the next moment's outcome. Decades later, explorers found the remnants of their journey on Kvitoya, a frozen testament to endurance, miscalculation, and the silent forces of the Arctic. Tents, journals, and photographic plates lay buried beneath decades of snow and ice, preserving glimpses of what the men had witnessed and endured. The journals revealed both meticulous scientific observation and the creeping influence of fatigue and uncertainty on human judgment. Photographs captured the jagged expanse of ice, frozen water channels, and distant glaciers, yet the precise course of the balloon and the final moments of the crew remained unknowable. Even in death, the Arctic had absorbed the expedition's story, leaving only fragments to hint at the immense indifferent space that had carried them so far from home. Above a world of ice and shadow, the ghost of the Ornan seems to hover still, its path forever etched only in frozen fragments and unanswered questions. The tragedy of the Stephenson-Wrangel Island expedition, 1921. When the small party landed on Wrangel Island in the summer of 1921, the Arctic stretched before them as a realm of stark beauty and silent menace. Ice-capped ridges rose from the tundra like frozen teeth, and snowfields reflected the pale sunlight in blinding flashes. The island seemed almost suspended between time and space, a world untouched by human presence, where even the simplest movement could be swallowed by the landscape. Vilhjalmur Stephenson had left the main party before the worst of the winter, leaving a handful of men to establish a foothold and conduct scientific observations. Their mission combined the ambition of exploration with the necessity of survival, yet the island's isolation quickly revealed the fragile line between endurance and catastrophe. The men set about pitching tents, arranging supplies, and charting hunting routes, each task heavy with the weight of isolation and responsibility. They marked trails across the tundra, established storage for provisions, and attempted to understand the seasonal patterns of the Arctic wildlife. Framed by the endless horizon, even ordinary tasks, hauling sledges, preparing meals, reinforcing shelters, took on an urgency that made fatigue almost a constant companion. Every decision mattered. The rationing of meat and seal blubber, the careful tracking of ammunition for hunting, and the timing of excursions to avoid sudden snowstorms or encounters with polar bears. In the beginning, camaraderie and shared purpose sustained them, but beneath the surface, the vast emptiness of the island whispered of challenges they could not yet foresee. Snowdrifts shifted daily across the camp, wind tore at flimsy shelters, and the distant outline of polar bears reminded them of nature's constant vigilance. Short Arctic summers offered little respite. When storms swept over the island, temperatures could plummet, and ice-crusted winds stung exposed skin even beneath layered clothing. The tundra itself was a trap. Frozen marshes and hidden crevasses turned routine journeys into perilous expeditions. The men kept meticulous notes of terrain, flora and fauna, yet the land resisted categorization. Every footprint or animal track seemed ephemeral, erased by the wind or drifting snow, leaving the explorers in an unending state of uncertainty and tentative navigation. As the weeks passed, game became scarce, fish yields declined, and rations grew alarmingly thin, forcing choices that gnawed at both body and mind. Hunting parties returned with less than expected, and the unpredictability of the Arctic Ocean currents left the men dependent on caches they had no certainty would suffice. Seal populations retreated, caribou were few, and ice conditions often blocked access to the only reliable fishing spots. Even water from melted snow required careful management. Desperation began to infiltrate daily routines. Men counted calories, measured portions, and sometimes ate what had previously been saved for emergencies. Every failure to secure sustenance increased anxiety, and the harsh arithmetic of survival became a constant presence in their thoughts. Isolation seeped into the men's thoughts. turning minor disagreements into deep rifts and causing journals to record observations tinged with fear and disorientation. Some complained of strange sounds across the ice, subtle creaks or distant crashes that may have been drifting glaciers, or perhaps the mind's response to endless white. Sleep became sporadic as anxiety mounted, and even daylight offered no comfort. The bright tundra was blinding and monotonous. Records indicate hallucinations, confusion over supply locations, and heated disputes over the interpretation of environmental signs. The landscape seemed to mock them, reflecting both their fears and the insignificance of their presence on an island governed entirely by wind, snow, and ice. One by one, the expedition's members succumbed to starvation, exposure, or misadventure, leaving behind tents, half-consumed meals, and cryptic notes that hinted at confusion and despair. Diaries recovered later recorded the slow unravelling of routine and discipline, and sporadic entries suggested that some men wandered away from camp, never to return. Footprints disappeared into snowdrifts, hunting tools lay abandoned, and some journals ended abruptly, leaving only fragments of narrative. Even the tents, partially collapsed and frozen, seemed to mark the absence of human agency, as if the Arctic had swallowed the men and left only traces for future eyes to interpret. The precise sequence of events remained impossible to reconstruct fully, creating an aura of both tragedy and mystery. When the survivors were finally found, the camp told a fragmented story, a puzzle of human endurance tested against a landscape both indifferent and inscrutable. Personal items were scattered in ways that hinted at both methodical survival attempts and frantic improvisation. Journals preserved observations alongside expressions of despair and fatigue. Photographs captured the stark and frozen terrain, and tents bore the marks of wind, ice, and hurried occupancy. Investigators could piece together only partial timelines and motives, leaving the full experience of those who endured and those who perished, forever shrouded in the Arctic's silence. Wrangel Island remained an untamed, enigmatic stage, indifferent to both ambition and suffering, or even decades later the land and ice seemed to keep secrets to themselves. The winds of Wrangel Island carry whispers of the men who vanished there, their stories etched into the snow yet never fully told. The sinking of the Soviet icebreaker, Cheluskin, 1934. The Soviet icebreaker Cheluskin cut through the frigid waters of the Chukchi Sea in 1934, its hull reinforced and its crew brimming with confidence in both skill and steel. Built to withstand the punishing Arctic ice, the vessel symbolised not only engineering prowess but also the ambition of a nation seeking to assert mastery over the northern sea route. Above, the sky hung pale and brittle, clouds scudding low over a horizon that stretched without end. Beneath, shifting ice sheets pressed silently against the water, grinding, colliding and drifting in invisible currents that hinted at danger even before it arrived. Passengers and crew alike sensed the weight of expectation pressing upon them, a quiet tension that mingled with the Arctic wind and whispered of trials yet unseen. Captain Voronin and his team oversaw the final inspections, checking machinery, lifeboats and provisions, while aware that the Arctic's reputation for indifference demanded constant vigilance. Engineers walked the decks, examining engines, pumps, and the hull's reinforced plating, noting every creak and strain that hinted at stress. Officers briefed the passengers, scientists, engineers, and even women and children on evacuation procedures, rationing, and emergency routines. Provisions were catalogued meticulously, from coal for the boilers to flour, salted meat, and dried fish. Every detail mattered, and yet the Arctic's vast silence reminded all aboard that preparation was fragile against forces they could not control. Even as the ship moved steadily northward, a sense of unease hung like frost in the air. As the ship pressed further into the Arctic, pack ice appeared in broken sheets, shifting and grinding with a patience and weight that no human could match. Ice floes pressed against the hull, scraping and buckling in ways that tested both metal and morale. Early incidents hinted at the ice's power. Minor scrapes of the hull, slight deviations in navigation, and moments when the crew had to brace against sudden jolts. Observers on deck noted the towering ridges of compressed ice, some higher than the ship itself, moving with a lethargic menace that belied their deadly potential. Journals captured these details with a mix of awe and anxiety, recording the glint of sun on ice, the eerie hush between distant groans, and the omnipresent sense that the Arctic was watching. Sudden pressure from converging ice floes crushed the ship's hull, sending tremors through decks and bulkheads, forcing the crew to brace against the roar of metal giving way. Steam hissed from ruptured pipes, coal dust choked the air, and the vibrations ran through the very bones of those aboard. Officers shouted orders above the din while sailors scrambled to secure equipment and monitor flooding. The ship's reinforced steel bent, groaned, and splintered under forces measured in tons, yet the Arctic remained unmoved, patient and absolute in its control. In those hours, time seemed suspended, each second marked by the increasing sound of ice grinding against the vessel and the quiet calculation of survival by those who understood they could do little more than endure. On the drifting floe, the crew erected tents and improvised shelters, rationed supplies with meticulous care, and huddled against winds that pierced even the thickest layers of clothing. Ice became both floor and foundation for survival, yet it was treacherous, shifting underfoot and occasionally threatening to crack. Men built stoves from salvaged materials, melted snow for water, and maintained strict watch rotations to guard against accidents or attacks by wildlife. Every detail of survival demanded attention: cooking, insulation, sleep schedules, and morale. The Arctic's relentless cold was matched only by the tension in the camp, where the psychological strain of uncertainty, hunger, and isolation weighed on each man and woman in the fragile encampment. Pilots descended from the grey skies, landing fragile aircraft on the floating ice, risking collapse, frostbite, and sudden gusts that could throw a plane off balance. Every landing required careful evaluation of ice thickness, snow cover, and wind direction. Signals were sent, flares ignited, and crew members guided the planes across shifting surfaces to bring survivors aboard. Each rescue was a delicate negotiation with a world that tolerated human presence only briefly, and each flight carried the possibility of catastrophe. Slowly, methodically, the men, women, and children were evacuated, their bodies and spirits battered but intact, leaving behind the frozen expanse that had both imprisoned and preserved them. In the weeks and months that followed, reports chronicled the expedition's endurance, the heroic feats of both crew and rescuers, and the Arctic's enduring indifference to human ambition. Diaries, photographs, and recovered artifacts revealed tents cut free from shifting ice, stoves constructed from scrap, and meticulous records of drift, temperature, and wind. The story of the Cheluskin became both a symbol of Soviet daring and a testament to human resilience under conditions that were, in the end, beyond human control. Even decades later, Arctic pilots, researchers, and historians would look to the Chukchi Sea and wonder at the combination of chance, skill, and endurance that had kept the crew alive amidst the immovable forces of ice. The ice that claimed the Cheluskin still drifts silently across the Chukchi Sea, its weight a reminder that human daring in the Arctic is measured not in triumph, but in survival against the unseen and unyielding forces of the North. The death of the Oxford University Arctic Expedition, 1931. March 12, 1931. The ice fields stretch beyond sight, and our instruments suggest calm though unease grows with every step, began a journal recovered years later, marking the expedition's first entry. The words, penned in careful ink by a young student, hinted at both optimism and the subtle anxiety that comes with venturing into Spitsbergen's unforgiving expanse. The Arctic air was brittle, and the landscape extended in monotonous stretches of white and grey, unbroken except for jagged ridges of ice and distant shadows of mountains. The Oxford University Arctic Expedition had set out with notebooks, compasses, and the meticulous ambition expected of scholars, unaware that the cold would test not only their endurance but the limits of observation itself. Tents were pitched along a sheltered ridge, supplies organised in neat stacks, and measurements taken with precision, though the Arctic had yet to test them. Instruments were aligned, barometers checked, and mapping duties divided among the students and faculty, their confidence bolstered by preparation and a sense of purpose. Meals were measured, stoves lit with care, and observations recorded in orderly columns. Yet in the hush of evening the wind whispered through the frozen ridges, carrying the faintest tremors of what would become an unpredictable, relentless presence. Small misalignments in supply arrangements or the scattering of tools were noted but were dismissed as trivial errors, oversights that would later prove ominous. A sudden squall erased the horizon and disoriented the young explorers as compasses spun and snow blinded familiar landmarks. Diary entries from this day are brief, sometimes incomplete, suggesting panic or haste, and the skies above seemed to collapse into one uniform grey. Attempts to retrace paths were thwarted by shifting ice and snowdrifts, leaving students wandering near tents or along frozen ridges, occasionally returning with frostbitten fingers or minor injuries. Even the most cautious students recorded a creeping sense that the Arctic's terrain refused to be catalogued, and that each measurement, each note, was a tentative claim over a world that cared little for human certainty. Maps were left behind in the flurry, tools scattered, and footprints led in directions no one could later trace, creating a puzzle the Arctic seemed to enjoy. One journal describes a notebook half buried in snow, its pages still legible but stained with frozen condensation. Small items, compasses, rulers, and pencils were abandoned in a pattern that seemed both purposeful and incomprehensible. Letters intended for the expedition's sponsors remain unfinished, torn or smudged, and some describe vague sightings of shadows or distant figures among the snowdrifts. These fragments, recovered weeks later, suggest a combination of misjudgment, fatigue, and the subtle manipulation of the environment, though the exact sequence of events remains unknowable. One by one, entries ceased, letters ended mid-sentence, and the remaining students documented their confusion with trembling hands and hurried notations. Reports of minor injuries, frostbite, and exhaustion appear sporadically, interspersed with hurried sketches of ice formations or hastily drawn maps that offer little clarity. The language shifts from scientific observation to fragments of fear: cannot find path, wind too strong, instruments useless, or tent shaken apart, must leave before dark, snow covers everything. The Arctic, in its quiet indifference, reduced meticulous records to scattered lines of partial comprehension, leaving historians and rescuers piecing together meaning from what little survived. Rations dwindled, frost seeped into every layer of clothing, and whispers of fear replaced scholarly debate in tents now battered by relentless wind. The students attempted to maintain routines, melting snow for water, calculating caloric intake, and checking equipment, but the extreme cold and isolation made each task arduous. Journals note fleeting moments of levity, sketches of distant ridges, or attempts at humour, yet these are punctuated by terse observations of fatigue, confusion, and mounting despair. Observers of the recovered materials describe a camp that had been orderly at first, then gradually unravelled under the unrelenting pressures of wind, ice, and exhaustion, each page of a journal echoing the slow disappearance of human control. Messages intended for distant settlements were lost in snowdrifts, and flares faded into grey skies, leaving the students isolated in both body and mind. Any attempts to signal for help were obscured by the whiteness, misread by companions, or extinguished by sudden gusts of Arctic wind. Some entries speculate on the direction of supply depots or nearby camps, but these locations could never be confirmed, and the students' trust in their maps and instruments faltered. In their journals, one reads, "Signals vanish before they are seen. No reply, only silence answers us." A line that encapsulates the profound isolation that defined their final days. When rescue parties arrived weeks later, they found journals and letters arranged with enigmatic order, equipment left as if in sudden haste, and a landscape that offered no answers. Personal items were scattered, tents partially collapsed, and sledges tipped in directions that suggested confusion rather than deliberate movement. Investigators could reconstruct only fragments of the expedition's final hours, noting oddities that resisted explanation. A compass left atop a rock, a notebook wedged in snow, a stove partially dismantled. The Arctic had taken its toll quietly, leaving human traces in patterns both deliberate and inscrutable, and ensuring that the ultimate fate of several participants would remain unresolved. The scattered journals and snow-erased footprints remain the only witnesses to the Oxford University Arctic expedition, whispering secrets that the frozen Spitsbergen tundra will never fully reveal. The vanishing of the Aurora prospecting team, 1928. The Aurora prospecting team of 1928 set out along the northern Canadian coast with instruments, tents, and the quiet determination of surveyors untested by the Arctic's capricious nature. Their objective was precise: chart mineral formations, record geological features, and map the treacherous coastline where few had ventured. The summer sun barely rose above the horizon, casting a pale, cold light over a landscape of broken ice, snow-filled ridges, and hidden crevasses. Diaries recovered decades later hinted at optimism, meticulous planning, and an uneasy awareness that the Arctic could be both silent and relentless. The explorers knew they carried the ambitions of discovery, yet they were stepping into an environment where the ice itself could erase human presence in a single, untraceable moment. Tents were anchored on fragile ice, sledges loaded with geological tools and supplies, and instruments meticulously catalogued, a fragile order imposed upon a landscape that knew no compromise. Camp lines were staked with care, paths between tents marked with small cairns of stone, and fires built to provide warmth while conserving fuel. Rations were measured with precision, stoves tended carefully, and observations recorded in neat tables meant to last through weeks of Arctic isolation. Even as the explorers worked, the ice beneath them groaned and shifted subtly, a warning they could neither read nor interpret fully. Small cracks appeared near sledges, the sound of moving ice echoed across the frozen expanse, and a wind that seemed almost purposeful swept through camp with increasing frequency. Early expeditions across the ice revealed promising mineral formations, yet subtle shifts in the pack ice hinted at forces beyond calculation. The team drilled rock samples, examined strata, and recorded soil conditions, unaware that the ice was slowly undermining their stability. Footprints from one day were partially erased the next, and small items, chisels, sample boxes, and notebooks were occasionally found displaced, half-buried in snow. In one diary entry, a geologist wrote, "Veins of copper visible, yet the ice moves beneath our feet. We are not alone here." Even in these early days, the Arctic environment demonstrated an inscrutable intelligence, a silent power that tested the explorers' careful measurements and slow, deliberate progress. A sudden fracture in the ice sent tremors through the camp, the sound amplified across the frozen expanse and leaving a fleeting sense of panic among the team. One entry reads, "Tents shook as though gripped by a giant hand, ice groans in long, unbroken notes." Cracks propagated unpredictably, forcing the hurried relocation of tents and sledges. Pieces of ice drifted in unexpected directions, and equipment once firmly anchored teetered precariously. The explorers attempted to maintain calm, yet the Arctic's influence was immediate, asserting itself with sounds, smells, and movements that no training could have prepared them for. Some members rushed to secure instruments while others vanished, leaving behind sledges tipped over, tools scattered, and a campfire still smouldering as if abandoned mid-meal. Diaries fragment here. One page shows notes interrupted mid-sentence, another lists items left behind as if the writers intended to return but never could. One geologist attempted to drag a sledge across a shifting sheet of ice. Another paused to adjust equipment, while a third stood frozen, observing cracks propagate like veins across the surface. Human reactions, hesitation, fear, and urgency intermingled with the Arctic's quiet, inexorable force, producing a disappearance as silent as it was complete. Investigators arriving weeks later noted the enigmatic arrangement of equipment, footprints leading nowhere, and journals left open with entries abruptly ending. Geological samples were scattered yet intact, drills tipped over, and tents partially collapsed. Personal effects were found at intervals, suggesting that some had tried to escape the shifting ice, while others may have sought shelter and never reached it. One compass was found pointing inconsistently, a notebook partially buried under snow, and a boot standing upright on a ridge, as if paused mid-step. Every detail hinted at human activity interrupted suddenly, leaving a tableau of frozen questions. Speculation and reports could not reconcile the evidence, as the Arctic had erased nearly all traces, leaving only fragments of human presence. Some theorized that a sudden ice fracture had swept the explorers into the water. Others suggested disorientation and exhaustion led them onto unstable flows. Diaries mentioned strange sounds, abrupt wind shifts, and the faint scent of ozone rising from stressed ice, all of which reinforced the idea that the environment itself was the primary antagonist. Even modern reconstructions cannot explain the precise sequence of events, only that the team vanished from the frozen landscape without warning, leaving behind scattered tools, tents, and journals as silent witnesses. Every discovered artifact hinted at incompleteness, Sample boxes left open, notebooks with entries ending mid-word, and sledges partially buried in snow. Nothing suggested struggle, only sudden interruption. The Arctic had claimed its subjects quietly and completely, erasing evidence of their efforts and leaving behind a frozen puzzle. Attempts to follow footprints were fruitless. Many ended abruptly at fissures or snowdrifts that had shifted in the interim. In their silence, these fragments challenge anyone who studies them, preserving a mystery that the Arctic seems determined to keep. No one knows exactly what befell the Aurora prospecting team, who vanished into the Arctic's icy silence, leaving only scattered traces that challenge anyone who dares to reconstruct their last hours. The fatal voyage of the Norwegian trawler, Gaul's Arctic Survey, 1974. The Norwegian trawler Gaul carried its crew into the unknown, a vessel bristling with instruments, sonar arrays, and the quiet confidence of men trained to measure, record, and navigate the invisible contours of the Arctic seas. Every bolt, every deck plank had been inspected, every chart and log reviewed, yet none could anticipate the silent authority of ice that could twist and crush without warning. On board, sailors adjusted winches, scientists calibrated instruments, and the hum of machinery mingled with the nervous anticipation of exploration. The ship's hull, designed for both research and commercial fishing, cut through waters that shimmered with cold light, hinting at dangers that lay hidden beneath and beyond the visible horizon. Ambition and preparation seemed enough, until the Arctic began to assert its presence in subtle, inexorable ways. The Gaul departed Tromsø with its crew of 26, including seasoned sailors, marine scientists, and technicians responsible for navigation, data collection, and research. The initial leg of the journey appeared routine. Sonar mapped the seafloor, water samples were collected, and trawls were carefully lowered to assess marine life. Yet even in these early days, minor anomalies were noted. Radar occasionally flickered in sudden bursts, ice floes shifted with unusual speed, and the ship's hull emitted faint groans that, in hindsight, were ominous signs. The Arctic, while appearing serene under a soft sun and drifting clouds, carried its own latent authority indifferent to human planning. As the trawler progressed farther north, pressure ridges began to appear along the horizon, vast sheets of ice that scraped and collided with each other in slow, deliberate motions. Sonar scans revealed hidden formations beneath the water, jagged and unyielding, and the hull responded with low, resonant groans that echoed across the deck. The crew grew vigilant, adjusting the ship's course and maintaining continuous watch. Yet the ice moved in unpredictable patterns, influenced by currents, wind, and unseen underwater terrain. For the scientists, the contrast was striking. The ocean offered data points and measurements, yet every reading reminded them that the Arctic's reality could not be reduced to charts alone. On board, the crew had relied on a newly installed gyroscopic navigation system, considered advanced for 1974, which allowed them to track position even when magnetic compasses faltered under polar anomalies. Engineers meticulously logged readings, noting slight deviations that hinted at magnetic disturbances common in the high Arctic. Yet these fluctuations were largely dismissed as minor. Supplies of fuel and fresh water had been carefully rationed, and the ship carried additional lifeboats designed for icy conditions, though some crew members later speculated that the design might not withstand sudden ice pressures. Even minor adjustments, like trimming ballast and reinforcing deck railings, became a daily ritual as the Gaul approached increasingly unstable ice fields, each measure a small defense against the invisible forces that would soon prove decisive. Subtle signs of trouble emerged over the following days. The ship's log records a night when creaking timbers and the rhythmic thud of ice against the hull kept the crew alert, as if the vessel itself were communicating a warning. Instruments occasionally malfunctioned, and small fractures in metal fittings were observed, though engineers assured the crew that repairs were possible. Tension built quietly on the decks. Some sailors moved with cautious deliberation, double-checking lines and cleats, while others monitored sonar and radar, noting the ice shifting faster than anticipated. The Gaul, a ship built for both research and fishing, had never faced ice pressures so severe or so sudden. Then, without warning, the ice closed in with a speed that seemed impossible. The crew scrambled to respond. Winches strained, hatches were secured, and instruments were hurriedly stowed. Logs end abruptly at this point, with only scattered entries suggesting urgency, hull stress increasing, cannot maintain course, flow converging. The hum of machinery faltered under the relentless pressure, and communication signals were disrupted. No distress call was sent. The Arctic swallowed the Gaul's presence so completely that it seemed the vessel vanished into the white, unyielding expanse without a trace. Observers later speculated that the hull likely succumbed to immense ice pressure, collapsing in a manner so sudden that the crew could not react. When investigators eventually reached the area, weeks later, the evidence was both fragmentary and haunting. Sections of hull were scattered across drifting ice, instruments were warped, and personal effects littered the frozen surface, suggesting the crew had attempted to salvage what they could. Debris was spread over an extensive area, implying a violent collapse rather than a slow drift. Navigation charts, trawl equipment, and scientific notes were recovered in fragments, but none provided a definitive account of what had occurred during the fateful hours. Even decades later, the Arctic conditions at the site remain difficult to reconstruct precisely, leaving critical details permanently obscured. Maritime analysts have long debated the Gaul's disappearance. Some posit that sudden ice compression caused catastrophic structural failure, while others suggest a combination of misjudged currents, insufficient hull reinforcements, and rapid weather changes. Survivor reconstruction is impossible. No crew returned, and the exact sequence of events remains uncertain. What remains are traces: the warped hull fragments, scattered personal items, and incomplete data logs that hint at routine operations interrupted by an invisible, unstoppable force. Every recovered artifact raises as many questions as it answers, reinforcing the notion that the Arctic, not human error, dictated the outcome. The legacy of the Gaul has endured in maritime research and Arctic surveying. Its disappearance prompted stricter shipbuilding standards for ice-strengthened vessels, updated safety protocols for scientific expeditions, and renewed respect for the unpredictable nature of polar waters. Yet even with modern technology and improved understanding of ice dynamics, the mystery of the Gaul's final hours remains unresolved. It has become a cautionary tale for Arctic exploration, a narrative of preparation and expertise confronted by an environment entirely beyond control. The ship's last mission is preserved not in heroic tales of survival, but in the enigmatic traces left across ice and sea. The Gaul vanished into the Arctic's silent expanse, leaving only fractured metal and unanswered signals to hint at the last moments of a ship that no one could fully chart. The ill-fated Soviet North Pole 1 drift station, 1937. In the summer of 1937, a team of Soviet scientists and explorers assembled on a fragile floe, preparing to establish North Pole 1, the first manned drifting station in the Arctic Ocean. Their mission was unprecedented: to remain on the ice for months, recording meteorological, oceanographic, and geological data while drifting with the flow across an uncharted expanse. The crew, led by Ivan Papanin, had trained rigorously for isolation and extreme cold, yet the Arctic promised lessons that no training could fully convey. As they unloaded prefabricated huts, instruments, and provisions, the crew felt both excitement and a creeping awareness of the environment's indifference. With meticulous care, the station's huts were anchored, instruments calibrated, and scientific plans mapped out, while the floe itself began its slow, unpredictable drift across icy waters. Thermometers, barometers, and hydrological instruments were installed to measure temperature, pressure, and ice movement. Their readings were transmitted by radio when conditions allowed. Observing the floe's subtle rotations and shifts became a daily ritual, a constant reminder that this small human outpost was entirely at the mercy of forces far greater than themselves. The ice could crack, twist, or tilt with barely a warning, and every measurement recorded by the scientists carried the silent testimony of nature's impermanence. As the Arctic expanse stretched beyond sight, radio messages to the mainland became intermittent, and the crew confronted the eerie quiet of a world entirely separated from human civilization. Letters and brief coded reports described life in careful detail, but transmission delays and interference meant that the mainland often received only fragments of information. Isolation was amplified by the monotony of the floe's drifting landscape, endless stretches of ice, occasional distant silhouettes of pressure ridges, and the pale reflection of the sun that never fully warmed the ground. the psychological weight of solitude pressed on the crew as heavily as the Arctic cold. Winter arrived swiftly, bringing gale-force winds, temperatures plunging far below freezing, and relentless pressure from the surrounding ice that threatened both structure and morale. Snowdrifts buried equipment, and frost formed in layers thick enough to crack windows and strain hinges. Each day, the crew meticulously cleared pathways, monitored heating systems, and recalibrated instruments affected by frost and condensation. Even routine scientific observations became endurance exercises, as extreme cold rendered fingers numb and made precise measurements increasingly difficult. The floe creaked beneath the huts, reminding them with every groan that it remained a living, moving entity. Cracks and creaks ran through the ice beneath the station, prompting engineers to constantly reinforce supports and monitor every subtle shift in the floe's slowly bending surface. Papanin and his officers logged each anomaly, noting areas where pressure ridges threatened to intersect with the camp. Supplies were moved to more stable sections of ice, and the crew learned to anticipate patterns of movement by observing subtle changes in cracks, ridges, and snowdrifts. Even the station's anchoring system, designed to hold against ordinary ice drift, proved insufficient in moments of sudden compression, forcing the explorers to improvise and adapt continuously. Rationing supplies, maintaining heat, and improvising repairs became daily necessities as the crew worked tirelessly to keep the station habitable. Each day a delicate balance between routine and catastrophe. Meals were scheduled with military precision, instruments were rotated between observers, and emergency drills were conducted in case ice fractures isolated portions of the floe. Despite the careful planning, tension quietly mounted. Small miscalculations could expose equipment to destruction, damage to living quarters could threaten survival, and a sudden fracture in the ice could render parts of the station inaccessible. Every task, however ordinary, carried a potential risk amplified by the Arctic's unforgiving environment. When the ice began to fracture more visibly, the decision to evacuate was executed with precision. Aircraft delivering supplies and personnel navigating perilous skies to extract the isolated explorers from the drifting floe. Float planes landed carefully on thin ice and open water patches, while crews coordinated by radio, timing each transfer to minimize exposure to sudden storms or shifting ridges. Every movement was measured, deliberate, and tense, underscoring the delicate balance between human skill and nature's unpredictable power. Though the team survived intact, much of the station remained behind, left to drift with the floe as it moved further into the Arctic's silent expanse. Though the crew returned safely, the station itself remained abandoned on the shifting ice, leaving behind instruments, observations, and a trail of unanswered questions about the Arctic's hidden currents and pressures. Subsequent analysis of weather patterns, floe drift records, and historic ice conditions suggested that portions of the station may have broken apart over time, yet no definitive mapping of its final location has ever been established. Scientists have speculated endlessly about lost data, submerged instruments, and ice dynamics unobserved by human eyes. The Arctic had claimed its authority without malice, preserving only fragments of human endeavour while continuing its drift, impervious to ambition or planning. The North Pole 1 station now rests somewhere on the Arctic floes, its instruments silenced, drifting endlessly under a sky that has witnessed human ambition and left it unanswered. The disappearance of the Fox Basin Hydrographic Party 1959. The frozen expanse of Fox Basin stretched beyond sight, a shifting mosaic of ice floes, open water leads, and dark ridges shaped by relentless tides. Seasonal currents carved invisible paths beneath the surface, and the faintest change in wind could transform a stable expanse into a treacherous labyrinth of cracks and pressure ridges. The Arctic seemed alive in its own right, indifferent to human ambition or preparation. For the hydrographic surveyors who ventured here in 1959, each measurement and each step across the brittle ice was a negotiation with forces that had existed long before maps had attempted to capture them. The landscape itself was a silent observer, capable of misdirecting, concealing, or swallowing all evidence of human presence. A small team of Canadian surveyors assembled with sledges, boats, and specialized instruments, preparing to chart waters that had eluded precise measurement for generations. Their mission was both scientific and strategic, to map depths, record currents, and improve navigational charts in a region crucial to maritime operations. Among the crew were experienced Arctic veterans, engineers, and young scientists learning to adapt instruments to sub-zero conditions. Sledges were stocked with food, blankets, and spare equipment, while boats were rigged for launching into narrow leads or frozen channels. Every item was weighed and tested, every instrument calibrated. Even so, the team understood that preparation could never fully account for the Arctic's subtle, shifting threats. Daily soundings, depth measurements, and ice surveys structured their routine, each entry in the log representing a fragment of knowledge in a domain dominated by uncertainty. Weighted lines measured depth through icy waters, echo sounders recorded irregular seabeds, and current meters captured the subtle movement of water beneath shifting flows. Teams ferried instruments across frozen channels, noting the displacement of ice ridges and the gradual drift of small flows. Temperatures often fell below -30 degrees Celsius, forcing hands numb and instruments prone to freezing. Every log entry was a battle against both the elements and the limits of human perception. Sudden whiteouts swept across the horizon, transforming familiar landmarks into illusions, disorienting even the most seasoned surveyors. Ice shifted beneath sledges and boats, sometimes with a subtle creak, sometimes with violent fracture. Footprints disappeared in seconds, buried by the wind, and instruments left on ice occasionally toppled into unseen channels. In these moments, the crew experienced the Arctic's quiet authority, the ability to erase certainty and replace it with a dangerous ambiguity. Reports in the log note minor disagreements over direction, hesitation in advancing, and caution exercised in every movement. False horizons and drifting icebergs made navigation increasingly perilous, while instruments and markers were sometimes found displaced, hinting at human activity disrupted by forces unseen. A survey flag planted on a floe might vanish overnight. A sledge left beside an open lead could be partially submerged or tipped askew. Minor anomalies, footprints leading nowhere, partially covered scientific notes, sledges trapped in shifting ice, added to the tension. Even the most precise measurements could not account for ice motion, driven by underwater topography, tidal flow, and wind patterns, leaving the crew perpetually uncertain of their position. Meals and camp routines became exercises in careful efficiency. Tents were pitched on the ice, secured against gusts that could tear canvas and scatter gear. Stoves were lit to thaw frozen rations, while thermometers recorded temperatures that tested human endurance. Every action was shadowed by the knowledge that a single misjudgment could be fatal. A hidden crack in the ice, a sudden lead opening, or a shifting floe could alter the course of the expedition in an instant. In personal logs, surveyors noted a strange quietness that seemed to press against the edges of perception, a subtle reminder that the Arctic held dominion over all human activity. Radio transmissions ceased abruptly, and the last recorded position suggested a path swallowed entirely by ice and wind. Check-ins that once confirmed progress disappeared from the logs, leaving only fragmented notes of uncertainty. Investigators later reconstructed possible routes, but each hypothesis was countered by the basin's capricious ice patterns. Even when small items were later recovered, they were scattered inconsistently, providing no clear sequence of events. The Arctic had preserved only whispers of human presence, erasing the tracks that might have explained the final hours. Investigators discovered abandoned campsites, extinguished fires, and instruments left mid-measurement, but no coherent pattern emerged. Sledges were partially sunk in ice, flags had been toppled or buried, and notes contained abrupt, incomplete entries. Observers surmised that the crew had attempted to continue work despite deteriorating conditions, but the sudden disappearance indicated a combination of disorientation, environmental pressure, and overwhelming isolation. Even decades later, analysis of ice drift, tidal changes, and wind patterns cannot fully reconstruct the hydrographic party's fate, leaving their story suspended in uncertainty. Subsequent expeditions to Fox Basin improved mapping techniques and safety protocols, yet the precise circumstances of the 1959 disappearance remain woven into the region's unpredictable ice. Satellite imagery, sonar surveys, and modern navigation aids now provide far greater accuracy, but the same subtle hazards, whiteouts, shifting flows, and hidden leads continue to challenge even the most experienced teams. The hydrographic party's disappearance serves as a reminder that no preparation, no expertise, and no technology can entirely counter the Arctic's quiet dominion. Their work survives in fragments of maps, scattered instruments, and the enduring respect that all explorers must hold for the frozen expanse they sought to understand. The Fox Basin remains an expanse where human footsteps leave only fleeting traces, and the vanished hydrographic party's path is recorded now only in whispers of ice and wind. The last flight of the Lockheed Ventura Polar Patrol, 1944. The Arctic sky stretched endlessly above the Lockheed Ventura as it lifted from Greenland's frozen airstrip, the aircraft cutting through a brittle dawn that shimmered over fjords glinting with ice. Inside the cabin, the crew of 6 moved with precise rehearsed motions. Fuel lines were double-checked, de-icing equipment secured, radio frequencies confirmed, and emergency gear stowed within easy reach. Each man understood that the Arctic was a realm both measured and unknowable, its beauty mirrored by a latent indifferent danger. The mission was reconnaissance, surveying northern convoy routes, mapping ice flows, and reporting weather conditions that could imperil Allied shipping. But even as the Ventura climbed into frigid air, the men knew that experience and technology offered only partial protection against a sky and sea governed by forces beyond calculation. The engines hummed steadily, wings cutting clean arcs through dense, cold air, while instruments were meticulously monitored. The co-pilot scanned compasses, altimeters and drift charts, cross-referencing with a rudimentary radar system that flickered with intermittent static. Early flight conditions seemed benign, yet subtle anomalies began to emerge. Gyroscopes drifted inexplicably, altimeters wavered beyond typical margins, and occasional auroral glows reflected off the ice below, distorting visual bearings. Crew members exchanged tense glances, noting the slight deviations and the Arctic's capacity to undermine confidence, even in the most seasoned aviators. Outside, the horizon shimmered with optical illusions, an expanse of whiteness where ice and sky merged into a disorienting, unbroken canvas. As the Ventura approached the high Arctic, the atmosphere became harsher, almost tangible in its hostility. Cloud banks rose like frozen walls, gusts of wind buffeted the fuselage, and temperatures dropped sharply, frosting the windshield and seeping into the cabin despite heaters running at maximum. Eyes strained to distinguish ice from water or cloud, and shadows shifted across drifting flows in ways that defied spatial logic. The navigator, accustomed to long polar flights, noted with unease that instrument readings occasionally contradicted each other, a subtle but persistent sign that the region was actively conspiring against clarity. Even minor miscalculations could send the Ventura far from safe landing zones into patches of uncharted ice or storm-ravaged ocean. Disorientation mounted as compasses spun and sextants struggled to pierce the thick cloud cover. The horizon had become a uniform expanse of white, a featureless void where light and ice merged into one. Crew logs later revealed moments of confusion. The navigator debated whether a distant shadow was a berg, open water, or a mirage. The co-pilot adjusted radio frequencies repeatedly, only to hear static and fragmented voices from Greenland stations. Subtle turbulence shook the wings, and ice accumulation on the propellers caused the engines to strain. Fatigue crept in as men wrestled with a combination of human fallibility and the Arctic's deceptive perfection, a landscape that offered endless data yet obscured every meaningful landmark. Amid the shifting light and frozen expanse, the crew noted subtle but troubling anomalies in their fuel gauges and engine pressures, details that would have seemed minor elsewhere, but in the Arctic became ominous signs of impending disaster. Temperatures far below zero caused the Ventura's oil viscosity to fluctuate, forcing the engines to work harder and creating small but dangerous stress points along the crankshafts. Condensation formed in unexpected places, freezing electrical contacts and intermittently cutting power to navigation instruments. The crew improvised cycling switches and recalibrating sensors while scanning the horizon for any recognizable landmarks, but every attempt was hampered by a combination of wind shear and reflective glare off ice fields that created mirages. These compounded mechanical and environmental challenges reinforced a growing sense that the Arctic was actively shaping the flight's fate, testing both skill and endurance in ways the crew had not fully anticipated. Critical decisions became unavoidable. The pilot altered altitude to escape pockets of turbulence, while the navigator suggested a risky heading to compensate for drift. balancing instinct against instruments that could no longer be fully trusted. Hydraulic lines groaned under stress, frost formed along wing edges, and engine gauges fluctuated sporadically. Radio messages, when they broke through, were brief and fragmented, observations of cloud movement, scattered reports of drifting ice, and cryptic warnings about difficulty maintaining course. Every adjustment was calculated in silence, the tension in the cabin growing heavier with each minute as the Arctic's forces tested both man and machine. The final transmissions were as fragmented as the instruments themselves. Voices crackled through static, some calm, others taut with urgency, reporting anomalies, shifts in altitude, or worsening ice conditions below. The Ventura, designed for long-range patrols, was now navigating a domain that instruments illuminated only partially, where every reading was suspect and every visual cue a potential deception. The crew's skill and training could no longer guarantee safety. The environment demanded surrender to its unpredictable rhythms. Moments later, radar contact ceased, and the aircraft vanished into a curtain of clouds and Arctic whiteness. When search teams reached the area days later, evidence was sparse and enigmatic. Radar logs indicated erratic flight paths. Minor debris and personal effects lay frozen atop drifting ice, and ice-scattered instruments suggested severe turbulence or mechanical failure. Weather analysis hinted at the possibility of a sudden microstorm, with wind shear strong enough to overwhelm the aircraft's stability. No definitive reconstruction could account for the exact sequence of events. Investigators could only speculate on mechanical malfunctions, navigational error exacerbated by magnetic anomalies, or sudden icing that rendered the Ventura uncontrollable. The precise details of the aircraft's final moments remain permanently obscured by the Arctic's indifference. The disappearance of the Ventura led to tangible advancements in Arctic aviation. Aircraft were reinforced to withstand ice accumulation, de-icing procedures improved, and navigational protocols were adapted for extreme polar conditions. Search and rescue strategies were refined, emphasizing rapid response and aerial redundancy in regions where visibility, magnetic interference, and weather rendered traditional methods unreliable. Even modern historians and aviators studying the flight recognize it as a stark reminder. No matter how advanced, human technology remains vulnerable when confronted by the Arctic's vast, unpredictable expanse. Into a veil of clouds that hid every secret, the Lockheed Ventura vanished above the polar horizon, leaving only fragments of radio signals and the enduring mystery of a flight that no one could trace.